Some people don't understand when it's time to leave. He said it like he was commenting on the weather, like breaking a woman's livelihood was just another Tuesday. Mia Carter stood in the wreckage of everything her father had built, oil-stained concrete, shattered tools, 30 years of love, reduced to rubble in 20 minutes, and she didn't cry. She looked at the man who said it and made him a promise he didn't know she was making yet. If you're watching this, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss a single moment of what happens next. The rain started around 6 that evening, the kind of cold driving Montana rain that comes in sideways and finds every gap in your jacket, every crack in a window frame, every place you forgot to seal properly. Mia Carter barely noticed it. She was underneath a 1987 Buick Riviera that belonged to old Harold Simmons, who was 81 years old, drove 4 miles to church every Sunday, and had told her 3 times this month that she was the spitting image of her daddy. She was not thinking about compliments or rain or anything beyond the transmission seal she was trying to coax back into alignment with her bare hands, and a flashlight held between her teeth. The shop was quiet the way it always got after 5. The radio in the corner played something country and low, more static than melody, because the antenna had been bent since last winter, and she hadn't gotten around to fixing it. That was the thing about running a shop alone. You fixed everyone else's problems first, and your own waited in line indefinitely. She heard the crunch of gravel in the lot and assumed it was Harold coming back to check on his car. Harold did that sometimes. He'd drop off the vehicle and then reappear an hour later, not because he didn't trust her, but because he was lonely and the shop was warm, and she always had coffee on. But it wasn't Harold's shuffling footsteps she heard. It was 3 sets of boots, deliberate and unhurried, the sound of men who had done this before. Mia rolled out from under the Buick and sat up, and she knew immediately. Not from anything specific she could name, just the way you know when something has shifted in the air around you, when the temperature of a room changes before anyone says a word. 3 men stood just inside the garage doors. 2 of them she didn't recognize. The third one she'd seen before, not here, not in the shop, but around town. He worked for the Voss Development Group. His name was Travis Holt, and he had the particular kind of face that belonged to men who delivered messages for people who were too important to deliver their own. "We're closed," Mia said. She stood up, wiped her hands on her work rag, and kept her voice even, controlled. Her father had taught her that too. Never let anyone see you flinch first. Travis Holt looked around the shop the way a buyer looks at a property he's already decided to purchase. His eyes moved over the equipment, the lifts, the rows of tools along the wall, the old pegboard where her father had hung every wrench in ascending order of size, a habit so ingrained in Daniel Carter that Mia had never changed it even after he was gone. "Mr. Voss wants to make sure you received his offer," Travis said. "I received it," Mia said. "I sent it back. He thought there might have been a miscommunication." There wasn't. Travis nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he suspected. The 2 men behind him shifted their weight, and Mia noticed for the first time that one of them was holding something a length of pipe just loosely down at his side, the way you hold something when you want someone to notice it without making it a declaration. "Mr. Voss is prepared to increase the offer," Travis said. "Substantially." "This shop isn't for sale," Mia said. "Substantially or otherwise." "Ms. Carter." Travis stepped forward just enough to make the distance between them smaller than it should have been. "You're a young woman running a business that's losing money every single month. We've looked at your financials. You've got suppliers you're behind with equipment that's outdated by 15 years in a customer base that's aging out. You know what happens to shops like this? They close. The only question is whether they close on your terms or someone else's." Mia didn't answer right away, because the worst part of what he said wasn't the threat hidden under it. The worst part was that some of it was true. She knew the numbers. She lived with the numbers. Every night before she went to sleep, she ran them in her head, what she owed, what was coming in, how much runway she had left, whether she could make it through another winter. But none of that was Travis Holt's business. "Get out of my shop," she said. The change was immediate. Travis's expression didn't shift dramatically. It just settled into something harder. Something that had been waiting underneath the professional courtesy the whole time. He nodded at the 2 men behind him. What happened next took less than 4 minutes, and Mia would replay it for weeks afterward, each time catching something new, some details she'd missed in the chaos of it. One man went for the diagnostic machine, the computerized unit her father had saved up 2 years, To buy the one that had let him compete with the dealerships when dealerships started going digital. He didn't smash it with the pipe. He tipped it over slowly, deliberately, watching her face as he did it. And then he drove his boot through the screen. The other man went for the tool wall, her father's tools. Every socket wrench, every extension bar, every screwdriver and breaker bar and torque wrench, organized the way Daniel Carter had organized them since before Mia was born. He swept the entire bottom row off the pegboard with his forearm, metal clanging against concrete in a cascade that seemed to go on longer than physics should have allowed. Mia started forward and Travis Holt stepped directly into her path. Some people don't understand when it's time to leave, he said. He said it quietly, almost gently, like advice between friends. She looked at him and she did not move and she did not speak, and whatever he saw in her face made him step back, just slightly, just enough that she noticed. They left the way they came. No hurry, no backward glances. Mia stood in the middle of her garage and looked at what was left. The Buick was untouched. They hadn't cared about Harold Simmons's transmission seal. They'd only cared about sending a message. The diagnostic machine was destroyed. 6 of her father's wrenches were bent. The lift controls had been pried open and something had been done to the wiring that she couldn't assess yet. The coffee maker in the waiting room, which had been there since 1994 and had survived 2 floods and 1 small electrical fire, was on the floor in pieces. She should have called the police. She knew that. She was already reaching for her phone. But she stopped when she heard something from the waiting room. She'd forgotten entirely. She'd been so deep under the Buick when they arrived that she hadn't registered it, hadn't even looked. There was a man sitting in the waiting room chair. He was older, maybe 65, maybe 70, gray-haired and weathered in the way of men who have spent most of their lives outdoors. He was holding a paper coffee cup, one of hers from the pot she'd put on at noon, and he was watching her with an expression that was very still and very serious and entirely impossible to read. "I saw everything," he said. His voice was low and even and unhurried. Mia stared at him. "Who are you?" "Jack," he said. "Jack Callahan. You've changed my oil 4 or 5 times over the past few months. Wednesday mornings. Black Harley Softail 2004. She knew the bike. She'd wondered about the man. He always came in early, always had exact change, always sat in the same chair and read the same battered paperback novel, and never asked for anything beyond the oil change and a cup of coffee. "You should call the police," Jack said. He wasn't telling her what to do. He was just stating a fact the same way he might observe that it was still raining outside. "I was about to." "Good." He stood up slowly, set the coffee cup down on the side table, picked up the paperback, and put it in his jacket pocket. "I'll give a statement. I saw their faces. I heard what they said." Mia called the police. While she waited, she sat on the concrete floor next to her father's scattered tools and started picking them up one by one because she had to do something with her hands, or she was going to fall apart. And falling apart was not something she could afford right now. Jack sat back down in his chair and said nothing. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay. He just stayed, which was somehow exactly the right thing. The officer who took the report was professional and sympathetic and honest in a way she appreciated. He told her that what happened was criminal mischief, potentially extortion, and that if Travis Holt had been operating on Richard Voss's behalf, there could be serious charges available. He took Jack's statement. He took the security footage from her camera. Though she already knew from experience that the parking lot camera had a bad angle on the front of the garage and probably hadn't captured the men clearly. He told her he'd be in touch. He left. Jack sat with her for another hour after that. He drank 2 more cups of coffee. He asked her about the lift controls and whether she thought the damage was purely mechanical or whether something electronic had been compromised. He asked the question like someone who understood the difference, and she answered him the same way because it was easier to think about wiring diagrams than about everything else. "How long has Voss been after the property?" Jack asked. "About 7 months," Mia said. "Started with letters, then an in-person offer, then a higher in-person offer, then the letter stopped being polite." She paused. "Tonight was new, though." "Tonight was an escalation," Jack said. "He's on a timeline." "How do you know that?" Jack looked at her. "Men who have time don't send people to break things. Men who have time send more letters." He stood up. "I'll come back Wednesday. Try to get some sleep." She didn't sleep. She spent most of the night cleaning up the garage, taking inventory of what was damaged and what was salvageable, running numbers she already knew were bad, and getting answers that were worse than she'd expected. By morning, she had a list. By morning, she also had something she hadn't anticipated, an answer to a question she hadn't quite known she was asking. Because at 4 in the morning, when she was alone in the shop with the rain still coming down and the front doors locked and the overhead lights buzzing their familiar fluorescent hum, she found something underneath her father's workbench, behind the spare parts bin tucked against the wall, in a spot that no one who didn't know exactly where to look would ever find, a small metal lockbox. The key was on the same key ring as the shop keys. She'd always assumed it went to something she hadn't needed yet. She'd been right, just not in the way she'd thought. Inside the lockbox was a letter, in her father's handwriting. The letter was dated 3 years before Daniel Carter died. 3 years before the diagnosis, before the slow, terrible unraveling, before the months in the hospital and the months at home, and the final months that Mia tried not to think about too often because when she did, the weight of them was nearly physical. He'd written it like he was talking to her in the shop. No formality, no preamble, just her father's voice on paper. Mia, if you found this, things are probably complicated. Things tend to get complicated around anything worth keeping. I want to tell you about a man named Jack Callahan. About 25 years ago, Jack came through Bozeman on a motorcycle with a blown gasket and no money, and a look on his face like a man who had been through something bad and was still deciding what to do about it. I fixed the gasket. He tried to pay me. I didn't take the money because he didn't have much of it and the buck hadn't been hard. He told me he'd come back and pay me properly when he had it to spare. I told him that wasn't necessary. He told me it was to him. He came back 6 months later and paid me triple what I would have charged. That's who Jack Callahan is. I don't know if you'll ever need to know this. I hope you won't. But if someone is coming after the shop and you don't know where to turn, find Jack. He's the kind of man who remembers debts. He's also the kind of man who has spent his life around people who don't forget what loyalty means. I love you, Mia. Keep the doors open as long as you can. Dad. Mia read the letter twice. Then she sat on the floor with her back against her father's workbench, and she did finally allow herself to cry. Not for long, not extravagantly, just enough to let some of what was pressing against her chest find a way out. Then she folded the letter carefully, put it back in the lockbox, and went back to work. Richard Voss made his next move within 48 hours of the break-in, and it was elegant in the way that truly nasty things often are. Mia found out about it when she called her primary parts supplier, Henderson Auto Parts, over in Billings, to place an order for the components she needed to repair what the men had damaged. She'd been working with Henderson for 6 years. The owner, Greg Henderson, had known her father for 20 before that. Greg picked up on the second ring and went quiet for a moment before he spoke. Mia, he said slowly, I've been meaning to call you. Something in his voice. She'd known Greg Henderson long enough to hear what wasn't being said. What's going on? She asked. Another pause. I got a call yesterday from a business consultant who said he represented a development group that was acquiring properties in your area. He told me that Carter's Auto Repair was in the process of closing and that any outstanding accounts should be flagged because payment might be uncertain. Mia went completely still. He told you we were closing, she said. That's what he said. Greg, we're not closing. I know that, Greg said, and she heard something that sounded like relief in his voice, mixed with discomfort. I know that, Mia. I've known your family for 30 years. But I have to be honest with you, he was convincing. He had documentation letters, what looked like financial records, showing the business in serious trouble. My accounts manager flagged your account. Unflag it, Mia said. Already done, the moment I picked up this phone. She leaned against the counter and closed her eyes for 3 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. How many suppliers do you think he called? Greg Henderson was quiet for a moment. He mentioned he was reaching out to several vendors in the region. Mia hung up and started calling. Billings Parts Depot, Rocky Mountain Equipment Supply, Frontier Tire and Wheel, Western Auto Hardware. She called every supplier she had regular business with, and by noon she had a picture that was thorough and infuriating. Voss, or someone acting for him, had contacted at least 5 of her vendors. Not all of them had flagged her account, but enough of them had. And word spread in that industry the way words spread in any small community, fast and without much regard for whether it was true. By 2 in the afternoon, Mia had 3 customer cancellations. By 4, she had 4 more. The story being told was simple and plausible and devastating. Carter's auto repair was on its last legs. You wouldn't want to leave your car with a shop that might close while it was in their garage. You wouldn't want to deal with the complications of getting your vehicle back from a business that had shuttered. Best to find somewhere stable. The cruelty of it was in the precision. Voss hadn't tried to overwhelm her with one dramatic attack. He was performing a careful elimination. First the intimidation to see if she'd break directly, then the assault on the shop to rattle her and damage her capacity to work. And now this, the quiet poisoning of her reputation, the systematic dismantling of the relationships she depended on. He was doing it because he thought she was alone. He was doing it because he assumed that when you looked at Mia Carter, 28 years old, no partner, no employees, an inherited business that was struggling financially, you were looking at someone who had no reinforcement available. Mia looked at her father's letter sitting on the counter where she'd left it that morning, and she thought about Jack Callahan, who came on Wednesdays. It was Tuesday. She picked up the phone. Jack answered on the second ring. "I need to tell you something," Mia said, "and I need you to tell me the truth about something afterward." "All right," Jack said. She told him about the suppliers. She told him about the cancellations. She told him about the full picture she'd assembled over the course of the day, the coordinated campaign that went well beyond 3 men with a pipe and instructions to break things. Jack listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. "How bad are the numbers?" he asked. "Bad enough that if I lose another 10% of my regular customers, I can't make rent next month," Mia said. She said it plainly without drama because it was just the truth. "If I lose 20%, I can't pay my outstanding supply invoices. And if I can't pay those invoices, the vendors who haven't flagged my account will start to." "Voss knows that," Jack said. "Of course he knows it. He's the one who told them." Another pause. "You said you had something to tell me." Mia looked at her father's letter. She'd considered briefly reading it to him over the phone. But that felt wrong somehow. It felt like something that deserved to happen in person. "My father left me a letter," she said. "He wrote it before he died, before he was even sick, I think. He wrote about you." The silence on the other end of the line was different this time. "He told you about the gadget," Jack said finally. Not a question. "He told me about the gasket," Mia confirmed. She heard him exhale slowly. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I'll come in tonight," he said. "If that's all right." "That's all right," Mia said. Jack arrived at 7. He came in through the side door, the one that faced the alley, and Mia realized she had never seen him use any door but the front before. He moved differently than she'd noticed on his Wednesday visits, more deliberately, more aware of the space around him, checking angles the way someone checks angles when they've spent a long time in situations where angles mattered. She made coffee. They sat at her father's workbench, the only surface in the shop that hadn't been touched during the attack because the men had apparently decided it wasn't worth the effort to go after something that looked like a wooden relic. She showed him the letter. He read it slowly, holding the paper with both hands. When he finished, he set it down and looked at it for a moment longer, and Mia saw something move across his face that he didn't seem to be trying to conceal or manage. "He was a good man," Jack said. "He was the best man I've known," Mia said. Jack nodded. "I know you need to keep this place open. I know what it means." "It's all that's left of him," Mia said. "What the building, not the tools, the idea of it, the way he ran it, the way he believed that a shop should work, that a mechanic should treat people." "I know it doesn't sound like anything except exactly right," Jack said. They were quiet for a moment. "I need to be honest with you about who I am," Jack said, "or who I was." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "I spent most of my life in an organization that the outside world has a lot of opinions about. Some of those opinions are earned, some of them are not. I've been retired for 8 years. I keep to myself. I come here on Wednesdays because your shop was the first place in this town that treated me like a regular person." He paused. "I have people I can call, men I trust, men who would come if I asked them to. I want to be clear that I'm not proposing anything illegal." "What are you proposing?" Mia asked. Jack looked at her steadily. "Presence, community, numbers. Richard Voss is doing what he's doing because he believes you're isolated. What I'm proposing is making that belief incorrect." "And these men you'd call," Mia said, "they'd be willing to do that. Some of them knew your father, Jack said. One of them a man named Ray. His wife's car broke down outside Bozeman 12 years ago. Your father drove 40 minutes to help her and wouldn't take a cent for it. Ray has mentioned that to me more than once over the years. Mia stared at him. My father helped a lot of people, she said slowly. He never talked about it. He just did it. That's usually how it goes, Jack said. The people who help without expecting anything don't usually advertise, but the people they help, they remember. He picked up his coffee cup. Your father built something here that wasn't in the equipment or the building. He built it in people. Mia sat with that for a moment. There's something else, Jack said. His voice shifted almost imperceptibly and she found herself paying more attention. I've been watching Voss since the first time you mentioned him to me, passively just paying attention. And I've heard some things that concern me. Concern you how? Mia asked. This isn't the first time he's done this, Jack said. The campaign he's running against you, the intimidation, the supplier pressure, the reputation damage. This is a pattern he's used before. There was a farm supply business in Livingston 4 years ago, a hardware store in Shelby 3 years ago, a small hotel in Hardin 2 years ago. All of them sold to Voss at below market prices after extended campaigns of exactly this kind. All of them thought they were fighting an isolated battle. Mia absorbed this. None of them knew about the others. None of them knew, Jack confirmed. That's how it works. You isolate the targets. You make each one feel like they're the only one struggling, the only one being squeezed, and eventually they give in because fighting alone is exhausting. But if they'd known about each other, then it would be a pattern, Jack said. And patterns can be investigated. Patterns can be proven. That's the difference. Mia looked at him for a long moment. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the second Wednesday, I sat in that waiting room and listened to you tell a customer on the phone that you'd figure out a way to make the payment deadline work, Jack said. I know that look. I've seen it on people who are being worked on methodically and don't know it yet. Outside, the rain had stopped. The shop was very quiet around them, the kind of quiet that settles in after noise richer and more present than regular silence. What do we do first? Mia asked. Jack set down his coffee cup. First, you open the doors tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., the same as always. You call back every customer who canceled, and you tell them that Carter's Auto Repair is open operating normally, and that any rumors to the contrary are not accurate. You don't elaborate, you don't explain. You just state the fact, and you make it plain. And then I make some phone calls, Jack said, and then we start collecting information. Mia nodded slowly. These people he's done this to before. The farm supply place, the hardware store. They might be willing to talk. I think they've been waiting for someone to ask the right question, Jack said. He stood up, put on his jacket, picked up his coffee cup to carry it to the trash the way he always did. One more thing, Mia said. He stopped. The men who came here, she said. Travis Holt, the other two. Do you know them? Jack's expression didn't change exactly, but something settled in it. Something that was neither warm nor cold, but very focused. I know the type, he said. They'll come back if Voss tells them to. Men like that don't stop until there's a reason to stop. Which is why you said we need presence, Mia said. Numbers. Numbers change the math, Jack said. When Voss sends those men back, I want the math to be different. He put on his jacket, said goodnight, and walked out the side door. Mia sat alone in the shop for a long time after he left. She thought about her father, about the letter, about 30 years of small kindnesses, gaskets replaced, and tires changed, and strangers helped on roadsides, and payments accepted late without complaint, and about how none of those moments had seemed like anything at the time. Just her father being who he was, just Daniel Carter doing what he believed a person should do. She thought about Richard Voss, who had built a kind of power out of identifying people who were alone and picking them apart carefully. And she thought about what Jack had said. Your father built something here that wasn't in the equipment or the building. He built it in people. Mia picked up her father's letter, folded it, and put it back in the lockbox. Then she unlocked the front doors of the shop, pulled the sign from closed to open, and started making a list of every customer who had canceled. It was 9:30 at night. She didn't care. She was going to call every single one of them. And in the morning, she was going to open those doors at exactly 7 o'clock. And she was going to keep them open and she was going to make Richard Voss understand that he had made a significant error in his calculation about who Mia Carter was. He'd looked at her and seen a young woman alone with a failing business and no resources and no reinforcement. He'd seen correctly about the resources. He'd been wrong about everything else. Mia made 14 phone calls that night. She sat at her father's workbench with her list and her phone and a cup of coffee that went cold before she remembered to drink it, and she called every single customer who had canceled. She didn't rehearse what she was going to say. She didn't prepare a script. She just dialed and waited, and when someone picked up, she told them the truth in the simplest possible terms. "This is Mia Carter. Carter's Auto Repair is open. We are not closing. Whatever you heard, it isn't accurate, and I wanted you to hear that directly from me." Some of them were embarrassed. Old Pete Garland, who'd been bringing his pickup in twice a year since her father was still alive, stumbled over his words, trying to explain why he'd canceled talking about something he'd read online, something a friend had mentioned, and Mia could hear in his voice that he felt bad about it and was grateful to have an excuse to walk it back. "I'll reschedule first thing tomorrow," Pete said. "Mia, I'm sorry. I should have called you directly instead of listening to. I should have just called." "It's okay, Pete," she said. "I'll see you tomorrow." Not all of them were Pete Garland. A woman named Sandra Reeves, who owned a hair salon on the east side of town and brought in her Honda Civic every 3 months for maintenance, was cooler on the phone, more cautious the way people get when they've been told something that scared them, and part of them is still holding on to it even after they've been told it isn't true. "I heard it from 2 different people," Sandra said. "I understand," Mia said, "but I'm telling you from the shop right now. The doors are open. I'm standing here. What time works for you this week?" Sandra rescheduled. Not enthusiastically, but she rescheduled. By the time Mia finished the last call, it was past 11. She'd recovered 8 of the 14 cancellations. The other 6 either didn't answer or told her politely that they decided to try somewhere else for now. Maybe they'd come back later, they weren't sure. She wrote those 6 names down in a separate column and sat looking at them for a moment. 6 customers gone. Maybe temporarily, maybe not. Either way, 6 was better than 14, and 14 had been better than nothing, and nothing was what she'd had when she started the night. She locked up, drove home, and slept 4 hours. At 6:40 the next morning, she was back. At 7 o'clock exactly, she flipped the sign to open. At 7:12, a truck pulled into the lot. It was Ray Kowalski. Mia didn't know Ray Kowalski. She'd never met him. He was a big man in his late 50s, gray stubble, and a canvas jacket with the collar turned up against the morning cold, and he drove a 2001 Ford F250. That had a replacement panel on the driver's side door that was a slightly different shade than the rest of the truck. He came in and asked if she could look at his transmission. "Jack Callahan sent me," he said, not making a production of it, just stating a fact the way you'd state your name or your address. Mia looked at him for a moment. "The man whose wife broke down outside town," she said. Ray Kowalski looked at her steadily. "Your father drove out to help her at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. She was 7 months pregnant. She'd been sitting on the side of the road for 2 hours and nobody had stopped." He paused. "He followed her all the way home to make sure she got there safe. Wouldn't take any money, just said to pass it on someday." Ray looked around the shop at the pegboard with her father's tools, at the coffee maker that was new now because the old one was in pieces. "I heard you could use some business." "I can always use business," Mia said. "Let me have a look at the transmission." She worked on Ray's truck all morning. The transmission turned out to have 2 separate issues, one she could fix today and one that would need a part she'd have to order, and she was explaining this to Ray over the hood when another vehicle pulled in. Then another. By noon, she had 4 vehicles in the shop or waiting in the lot, and all 4 of them had come because of Jack. She didn't ask how Jack had managed it. She just worked. But sometime around 2 in the afternoon, while she was deep in the engine compartment of a Chevy Colorado that belonged to a quiet man named Dennis, who told her he'd heard she did honest work, she thought about what Jack had said the night before about her father building something in people, and she began to understand what he meant in a way that was more than intellectual. Her father had spent 30 years giving pieces of himself to people in small, practical, unglamorous ways. A fixed gasket, a roadside rescue, a bill that came out lower than anyone expected. An extra hour of work charged at no cost because the job had taken longer than the estimate, and he didn't believe in making someone pay for time they hadn't planned on spending. 30 years of these moments scattered across communities and decades, and she had never known they were accumulating into something. She had just thought that was who her father was. She hadn't understood and that it was also what he was building. Dennis came around to check on her progress, and she asked him carefully how he had heard about the shop. "Man named Jack," Dennis said. "He mentioned your father helped out a friend of his years back. Said the shop was worth supporting." He shrugged. "That's good enough for me." "Did you know my father?" Mia asked. Dennis shook his head. "Never met him, but Jack said he was the kind of man who helped people without making them feel bad about needing help." He paused like he was deciding whether to say the next part. "That's rarer than people think." Mia turned back to the engine and worked without speaking for a moment. "Yeah," she said finally, "it is." The day ended better than it had started, which was more than she'd expected. By the time she locked up, she'd completed 3 jobs, had 2 more scheduled for the following morning, and had received a call from Greg Henderson in Billings saying that he'd personally reached out to 2 other suppliers he knew had been contacted by Voss's people and told them to disregard whatever they'd been told. "Your father fixed my brother's truck in 2003, Greg said when she thanked him. "Wouldn't let us pay for the parts, said the parts were cheap and the labor was the real cost, and he wasn't charging for it because it had only taken him an hour and he'd have been there anyway." Greg cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to do something about that for 20 years. I'm glad I finally got the chance." Mia hung up and stood in the empty shop, and for a moment she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not just gratitude, but something heavier and more complicated. Something that felt like grief and wonder simultaneously. Because her father was everywhere today. In phone calls from people she'd never met. In the memory of a pregnant woman on a roadside. In the deliberate loyalty of a man who'd been waiting 20 years to balance an account. And she hadn't known. She'd worked alongside him for years, and she hadn't known the scale of what he was quietly doing. She sat down and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of that feeling, and then she picked up her phone and called Jack. 4 jobs today," she said when he answered. "Ray's truck, Dennis's Colorado, and 2 others. Plus Greg Henderson made calls to 2 suppliers." "Good," Jack said. He sounded like a man crossing items off a list. "How many people are you calling?" Mia asked. "Enough," Jack said. "How are your finances right now, honestly?" She gave him the honest number. It was not a comfortable number to say out loud, but she said it. "You can hold for about 3 weeks at current revenue before you hit a wall," Jack said. "About that." "Then we have 3 weeks to change the picture significantly," Jack said. "That's enough time." "For what?" "I've been making calls about Voss," Jack said. "The hardware store in Shelby, the hotel in Hardin, the farm supply business in Livingston. I've found the owners." Mia went still. "You talked to them?" "All 3, Jack said. And Mia, every one of them, said the same thing." "What?" "That when it was happening to them, they felt completely alone. And that if they'd known someone else was going through it, they would have fought harder." He paused. 2 of them still have documentation. Letters, emails. One of them recorded a phone conversation with someone who turned out to be working for Voss. He recorded it because he didn't know what else to do. And he was scared, and he thought maybe someday he'd need proof. Mia felt something tighten in her chest. He never used it. By the time he thought about using it, he'd already sold. He was exhausted. He just wanted it to be over. Jack's voice was even, but she could hear something underneath it, controlled and cold. "He gave me the recording." "Jack," Mia said slowly, "what exactly are you doing?" "Building a case," Jack said. "If the pattern exists, and it does, I can see it clearly now. Then what Voss has been doing across multiple counties over multiple years is not just harassment. It's organized fraud. It's criminal conspiracy. The problem was that no one victim ever had enough of the picture to make it a case. They only saw their own piece. But if you put all the pieces together, then you have something," Jack said, "something a prosecutor can actually use." Mia sat down on the concrete floor, which was becoming a habit she was going to have to address at some point. "Why are you doing this, Jack? And don't say it's about the gasket. It started with the gasket, but that's not what this is." He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought maybe she'd pushed too far. "I spent a lot of years in my life operating outside the lines," Jack said finally. "Not always in ways I'm proud of. When I retired, when I actually stopped and looked at the balance sheet of my life, I decided I wanted the last portion of it to look different than the rest." He paused again. Your father never asked me anything about my past. He fixed my bike and gave me coffee and treated me like a person who deserved to be treated decently. I've never forgotten that because people like that aren't common. His voice dropped slightly. And people like Richard Vossman who look at what someone has built and decide they can just take it. I have a particular reaction to those people that I've been keeping on a leash for 8 years. Maybe it's time to let it off the leash, Mia said. Legally, Jack said, and she could hear something that might have been a smile in his voice. We're going to do this completely legally. She almost laughed. Almost. Okay, she said. What do you need from me? Tomorrow morning I'm going to bring someone to the shop, Jack said. A man named Walt Briggs. He's a retired investigator used to work financial crimes for the state. He knows how these schemes are structured. I want you to tell him everything, the whole picture, from the first letter to the attack to the supplier calls. And I want you to tell him about what you know about the other businesses, what I've told you. Does Walt know what you did before you retired? Mia asked. Walt Briggs has known me for 30 years, Jack said. He knows everything. He still trusts me, which should tell you something about both of us. The next morning, Walt Briggs arrived at 8 o'clock in a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked taillight and a back seat full of accordion folders that appeared to have been there since the Clinton administration. He was a small, neat man with a white mustache and the kind of eyes that were always slightly narrowed, like he was perpetually reading fine print. He shook Mia's hand firmly, accepted coffee without being asked, and sat down at the workbench with a legal pad and 3 different colored pens. Start from the beginning, Walt said. Don't edit, don't decide what's important. Tell me everything in the order it happened. Mia told him everything. Walt wrote constantly and interrupted rarely, but when he did interrupt, his questions were precise and slightly unexpected. Not the questions she would have anticipated, but questions that seemed aimed at the architecture of what had happened rather than the surface. He asked about the timing between the initial offer and the first sign of supplier pressure. He asked specifically about how the men had entered the shop and what they damaged and in what sequence. He asked whether Travis Holt had said anything specific about timelines or deadlines. When she mentioned that Travis had said, "Some people don't understand when it's time to leave," Walt's pen stopped moving. "He said that to you directly?" Walt asked. "Yes," Mia said, after they had already done the damage, like an afterthought. Walt wrote it down, underlined it, and your witness Callahan, he was present for that statement. He was in the waiting room, Mia said. He told the police officer he heard everything. Walt nodded slowly. Good. He wrote something else, circled it. Very good. They worked through the morning, and at some point, Jack arrived with a manila envelope that he set on the corner of the workbench without comment. Walt opened it, looked through the contents methodically, and then looked up at Jack over the top of his reading glasses. This is the recording from the Hardin owner, Walt asked. Yep, Jack said, and he's willing to sign a statement. He's already signed it, it's in there. Walt looked back at the contents of the envelope for a moment. Richard Voss has a very expensive lawyer, he said. His name is Gregory Cannon, and Cannon is good. I've seen his work before. Good enough to make this go away? Mia asked. Walt looked at her over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who had been asked variations of that question for 30 years and had learned exactly how to answer it. Good enough to make it complicated, he said. Not good enough to make it disappear if the pattern is as clear as what I'm looking at right now. He closed the envelope. I have a contact in the state AG's office, Financial Crimes Division. Her name is Detective Laura Chen, and she has been looking for something on Voss for about 18 months. Mia stared at him. She's already been looking. Walt set the envelope down. She's been looking for a thread to pull, he said. I think we just found it. The shop was very quiet for a moment. Why hasn't anything happened to Voss before now? Mia asked. Walt picked up his coffee cup. Because every victim thought they were fighting alone. Because when you feel isolated and exhausted and outgunned, you make deals you don't want to make just to stop the bleeding. And when you make the deal, you sign paperwork that makes it very hard to claim later that anything improper happened. He paused. Richard Voss is not stupid. He builds paper trails that look legitimate from the outside. Each individual transaction looks like a distressed sale, a struggling business who makes a pragmatic decision and sells. The coercion that preceded that decision doesn't appear on any document. Unless you have the recording, Jack said. Unless you have the recording, Walt agreed, and the testimony of people who've been waiting to give it. He looked at Mia directly. You understand this will take time. Even with what we have, this isn't a week's worth of work. There will be a period where Voss is still operating, still pressuring you, and we'll be building the case in parallel. How long? Mia asked. Weeks, not months, Walt said. If Chen moves the way I expect her to move, and if the pattern holds up the way I think it will, we're talking 4 to 8 weeks before something formal happens. I'm not sure I have 4 to 8 weeks, Mia said plainly. My financial runway is about 3 weeks. Walt and Jack looked at each other. Then we solve 2 problems simultaneously, Jack said. Walt handles the legal architecture. We handle the business. The business is my problem, Mia said. No, Jack said, and his voice was very even, very quiet. Right now it's our problem. She wanted to argue. She was already drawing breath to argue because she had spent her entire adult life solving her own problems, and the instinct to refuse help, even when help was being offered freely, was deeply embedded in her. But she looked at Jack, retired biker, Wednesday morning coffee drinker, the man her father had written about in a letter he'd hidden under the workbench, and the argument died before she gave it voice. Okay, she said, what do we do? What they did over the next 4 days was systematic and surprisingly quiet. Jack made calls. Walt Briggs drove to Livingston and Hardin and Shelby and came back with signed statements and documents, and in the case of the Livingston farm supply owner, a second recorded conversation that the man had captured 18 months ago and never known what to do with. Mia opened the shop every morning, worked every job that came in, and received a steadily increasing number of customers who had been referred by people she'd never met, but who all seemed to have some connection to Jack or to her father's history of small kindnesses. On the 3rd day, something happened that changed the temperature of everything. Mia was finishing up a brake job on a Dodge pickup when a car she didn't recognize pulled into the lot. A black sedan, new model, tinted windows, the kind of car that could have belonged to a dozen different types of people, but in context suggested only a few of them. 2 men got out, not Travis Holt and his associates, different men, but the same general category. They didn't come into the garage. They just stood by their car and looked at the shop for a long moment, and then one of them took out his phone and appeared to photograph the building, and then they got back in the car and drove away. Mia watched them go and felt the specific quality of dread that comes not from something that has happened, but from something that is clearly being planned. She called Jack immediately. Black sedan, 2 men photographed the shop, she said. How long ago? Jack Bella asked. About 2 minutes. There was a pause. Voss is getting impatient, Jack said. He knows his supplier pressure hasn't collapsed you. He's reassessing. What does reassessing look like for a man like Voss? Mia asked. It can look like a lot of things, Jack said carefully. But the most likely thing right now is he's deciding whether to escalate or whether to try a different angle. What kind of different angle? Something that looks legitimate, Jack said. He may have someone call the county permitting office try to kick up a question about your zoning or your occupancy certificate. He may contact your bank and try to create a problem with your accounts. He may try to purchase outstanding debt from one of your suppliers and then call it immediately. He's looking for a lever. Mia sat down on the running board of the Dodges she'd been working on. He has a lot of options. He does, Jack said, but so do we. Walt talked to Chen this morning. She's interested, very interested. She wants to meet with you at the end of the week. Mia absorbed this. That's good. It's very good, Jack said. But Mia, between now and then, I need you to be careful. And I need you to call me if anything changes. Anything. You sound like you're expecting something, Mia said. Jack's pause was just a beat too long. I've seen how men like Voss behave when they feel a window closing, he said. They push harder before they fold. It's almost a reflex. After she hung up, Mia went back to work. She finished the brake job. She called a customer about an upcoming oil change. She balanced the day's invoices and ordered parts for 2 jobs scheduled for Monday. She did all of it with her hands and her attention, while some other part of her mind, quieter and more alert, kept turning over what Jack had said. Men like Voss push harder before they fold. That evening, a man walked into the shop that Mia had never seen before. He was younger than Travis Holt, dressed in business casual, the kind of bland professional presentation that could mean anything, and he had the smooth, practiced manner of someone who spent his days in meetings. Ms. Carter, he said. Depends who's asking, Mia said. She kept her hands where they were on the engine she was working on. My name is Dennis Paulson. I'm an attorney. I represent a client who would like to make you an offer on this property. She didn't look up. Richard Voss. A very short pause. My client prefers. I know what your client prefers, Mia said. She set down the tool in her hand slowly and deliberately and looked at Dennis Paulson directly. Tell your client that this shop is not for sale. Tell your client that I've heard that message from him multiple times in multiple forms, and my answer hasn't changed and won't change regardless of what form the message takes next. Dennis Paulson maintained his professional composure admirably. My client is prepared to make an offer that represents fair market value plus a substantial premium that would... Mr. Paulson, Mia said, did your client tell you that 3 men came into this shop 2 weeks ago and destroyed equipment and threatened me? The composure flickered just slightly. I'm not aware of... Did he tell you that he contacted my suppliers and told them we were closing so that they'd freeze my accounts? Ms. Carter, I'm simply here to convey an offer. Did he tell you that investigators from the State Financial Crimes Division are currently reviewing his business practices across multiple counties? Dennis Paulson stopped talking. The shop was very quiet. Mia picked up her tool and turned back to the engine. Tell your client I said no, and tell him that the next time he wants to send someone to have a conversation with me, he should make sure that person is prepared to hear what I actually have to say. Paulson left without another word. Mia waited until she heard his car pull out of the lot, and then she called Jack. He just sent a lawyer, she said. Interesting, Jack said, and she could hear him thinking. He's trying to create a paper trail that looks like a legitimate negotiation. If he can show a series of good faith offers that you refused, it complicates any narrative about coercion. I told him investigators were looking at Voss, Mia said. Probably shouldn't have done that. Actually, Jack said slowly, that might have been exactly right. If Voss thinks we already have something official moving, it changes his calculations. He paused. He'll make a decision in the next day or two. Either he pulls back and waits, which gives us time, or he decides to go fast and hard before anything formal happens. Which one do you think he does? Mia asked. Mia. Fast and hard, Jack said with odd hesitation. He didn't get this far by playing it cautious when he felt cornered. His voice was steady and certain in a way that made her realize again that Jack Callahan had spent a very long time understanding how people operated when they were under pressure. He's going to move soon. I need you to be ready. Ready for what specifically? She asked. I don't know exactly what form it takes, Jack said. But it will be at night, and it will be significant. He's not going to send men to knock over your equipment again. If he comes back, it'll be to make sure there's nothing left to come back to. The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. Okay, Mia said. Her voice was steady. She was slightly surprised by how steady it was. Then let's make sure we're not alone when he does. That's exactly what I've been working on, Jack said. Get some rest. I'll call you in the morning. She didn't rest. She sat in the shop with the lights on until 11 o'clock, doing paperwork she didn't strictly need to do right now, listening to the highway, outside watching the parking lot through the garage windows. Nothing came. No cars, no footsteps, nothing but the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday night. At 11, she went home. At 2 in the morning, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway because you don't ignore calls at 2 in the morning when you've been told to expect something. Ms. Carter? The voice was male, older, with a regional accent she couldn't immediately place. My name is Frank Dempsey. I own the hardware store in Shelby, the one Voss took. Mia sat up. Mr. Dempsey, Jack Callahan gave me your number and told me to call if I had something you needed to know tonight. His voice was tight. Not frightened exactly, but close to it, the voice of a man who had been frightened for a long time and was now moving through it towards something. I've been watching Voss's company. I know some of the people who work for him, not management, just drivers, people who move equipment and materials. One of them is a cousin of mine by marriage. We don't speak often. Okay, Mia said. He called me an hour ago, Frank Dempsey said. He said he'd been asked today to be available tomorrow night, late, for what he was told was a demolition job. A pause. He said the address was in your area. He didn't know more than that. Mia was already out of bed, already reaching for her jacket. Mr. Dempsey, she said. Thank you. You didn't have to call. Yes, I did, Frank Dempsey said, and his voice was different now. Quieter and more settled, like a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally set it down more solid. Voss took everything my wife and I built over 22 years. I should have fought harder. I didn't know how then. He paused. I know something now that I didn't know then. We weren't alone. We just didn't know it. Another pause. Don't make the same mistake I did, Miss Carter. Call the people who are on your side. Call them tonight. Mia said goodbye and hung up. She stood in her living room in her jacket with her phone in her hand and looked at the time, 2:17 in the morning. She called Jack. He answered on the first ring. Frank Dempsey just called me, Mia said. I know, Jack said. I'm already on the phone with people. She could hear something in the background, low voice movement. Where are you? Home. Should I go to the shop? Not yet, Jack said. Stay where you are for right now. I'll call you back in 15 minutes. She sat on the edge of her bed and waited. The 15 minutes felt like something geological. Outside, the night was quiet in the specific way that nights in Montana get quiet in early spring, cold and still and enormous. She thought about her father. She thought about the letter in the lockbox. She thought about Frank Dempsey saying we weren't alone, we just didn't know it. Her phone rang. 12 minutes, not 15. Here's what's happening, Jack said. I've talked to people. They'll be in position by tomorrow night. But Mia, I want you to call the police before anything happens. I want there to be an official call on record. Will you do that? Of course, Mia said. When the time comes, Jack said. Not before. If we call now with nothing but a secondhand rumor, they can't act. But if you call when there's an active situation, then they have something to respond to, Mia said. Right. A pause. How are you holding up? Mia thought about it honestly. I'm scared, she said. But I'm not. I'm not shaking anymore. That makes sense. Earlier today I was scared and shaking. Now I'm just scared. That's the right direction, Jack said. That means you've already decided to stand your ground. The shaking is what happens when you haven't decided yet. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep, but she lay down and, somewhere in the early hours before dawn, she drifted into something that was close enough to sleep to count. When her alarm went off at 6:30, she turned it off, lay still for a moment, and then got up. She had a shop to open. And somewhere out there, Richard Voss was making his own plans for what he believed was going to be the last night Carter's auto repair would ever stand. He was about to discover how badly he had misread the situation. Mia drove to the shop, unlocked the doors, turned on the lights, and started the coffee. She worked through the morning with the kind of focused efficiency that comes from having no energy left for anything except the thing directly in front of you. She worked on cars. She took phone calls. She talked to customers the way she always talked to them, directly, warmly, with actual interest in what they needed and honest assessments of what she could do. Around 2 in the afternoon, Jack came in. He sat in his usual chair in the waiting room. He had his paperback novel. He poured himself a cup of coffee, and he sat there for the rest of the day, not doing anything in particular, not explaining himself, just sitting. 3 other men came in at various points through the afternoon. Ray Kowalski came back ostensibly to check on something about his transmission, and he sat in the waiting room too. A man named Leon, whom Mia had never met before, came in and asked if she needed help cleaning up around the garage, and when she said she was fine, sat down in the waiting room anyway. A 4th man she didn't know, heavy-set and quiet, parked his motorcycle in the lot and came inside for a cup of coffee and appeared to have nowhere pressing to be. The waiting room had never in the history of Carter's auto repair held 4 people at once. Mia worked and didn't ask questions. At 5 o'clock, she closed out the register and started putting away tools, and she looked out through the garage door at the 4 men sitting in the waiting room. None of them talking much. All of them very present, and she felt something move through her that was difficult to name exactly. It wasn't quite gratitude and it wasn't quite relief. It was something older and more fundamental than either of those things. Something that felt like the specific comfort of not being alone in a situation that you did not choose and cannot control. She poured herself a cup of coffee, went, and stood in the doorway between the garage and the waiting room and looked at Jack. You know, you don't have to stay, she said. Jack looked up from his book. I know, he said. Ray Kowalski picked up a fishing magazine from the side table and opened it to the middle. Leon turned his coffee cup in his hands. The 4th man looked out the window at the parking lot. Nobody left. And outside, the sun went down over Carter's auto repair, and the last real light of the day faded from the windows, And the night that Richard Voss had chosen for the end of everything gathered itself in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the lot, getting ready to arrive. The first hour after dark was the hardest. Not because anything happened, because nothing did. Mia sat in the office at the back of the shop with the internal door cracked open so she could see the garage floor, and she drank cold coffee and listened to the night settle around the building. Jack and the other three men had moved from the waiting room to less visible positions sometime around 8 o'clock, doing it quietly and without explanation, redistributing themselves with the particular economy of motion that told her this was not new territory for any of them. Ray had gone outside. Leon was somewhere near the side door. The fourth man, whose name she'd finally learned was Curtis, had positioned himself near the rear of the garage where the back wall met the equipment bay. Jack sat in the office with her. He didn't talk much. That was something she'd come to understand about him. He conserved words the way some people conserve money, spending them only when they were going to do something useful. What he did do was sit with his phone on his knee, checking it occasionally, and once every 30 minutes or so, he would send a brief text to someone she couldn't see and receive one back almost immediately. "How many people do you have out there?" Mia asked quietly sometime around 9. "Enough," Jack said. "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." She looked at her own phone. No calls, no texts. The detective Walt had mentioned Laura Chen had called that afternoon and spoken to Mia for 40 minutes, taking notes and asking the same kind of precisely targeted questions that Walt asked, the questions that cut to the architecture of what had happened rather than the surface of it. At the end of the call, Chen had said carefully that she couldn't discuss the status of any ongoing investigation, but that she wanted Mia to document everything and to call her directly if anything changed in the next 72 hours. Everything was about to change in the next 72 hours. Mia had not told Chen about Frank Dempsey's midnight call. She'd discussed it with Jack and Walt, and they'd agreed that secondhand information from a man who'd heard something from a cousin by marriage was not the kind of thing you brought to a state investigator if you wanted to be taken seriously. What you brought was evidence. What you brought was the situation after the fact when you had something concrete. So they waited. At 9:40, Jack's phone lit up. He looked at it, showed nothing on his face, and typed a response. "Ray says there are vehicles staging on the access road," Jack said, "about a quarter-mile east." Mia felt her stomach contract. "How many?" "3 so far." He typed again, waited. 4. She stood up from the office chair, not from any plan to do anything, just because sitting suddenly felt impossible. "Should I call 911? "Not yet," Jack said. "If we call now, they'll see the response and pull back, and then nothing happens tonight, and we're back where we were, except now Voss knows we had warning and he plugs the leak." He put his phone in his jacket pocket and stood up. "When they move, you call, not before." "How will I know when they move?" "You'll hear it," Jack said simply. He went to the door that connected the office to the garage. He stopped there, hand on the frame, and turned back to look at her. "Stay in this office," he said. "Whatever happens, stay in this room until I come back for you or until you're sure you need to get out. If you need to get out, you go through the back and you go to the neighbor's house on the left and you call from there." He paused. "You understand?" "I understand," Mia said. "Jack, Ishejijik." "Yeah." She looked at him. He was 60-something years old, gray-haired, wearing a worn leather vest over a black jacket, standing in the doorway of her father's shop, like he'd always been there, like he was supposed to be exactly here at exactly this moment. "Thank you," she said. Jack nodded once, the way people nod when thank you is inadequate, but there's nothing better available. Then he went into the garage and the door swung half shut behind him. Mia stood alone in the office. She picked up her phone and held it in both hands and listened. For a few minutes, nothing. The shop breathed around her, the quiet tick of metal cooling the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner where she kept drinks for customers, the distant sound of highway traffic that was always there, the ambient white noise of a life lived adjacent to a road. Then she heard it. Engines. Not the sound of a single vehicle passing on the highway. Multiple engines close together, coming slower than highway speed, the particular throttle of vehicles that are maneuvering rather than traveling. She pressed herself against the wall beside the office door and looked through the gap into the garage. In the dim light, she could see the silhouettes of what her father had built, the lifts, the tool wall, the old pegboard with his wrenches in ascending order of size, the coffee maker on the counter in the waiting room, And for one terrible second, she saw all of it. The way you see something you might be about to lose with the full weight of what it means, every memory pressed into every object, like something carbonized and permanent. She called 911. This is Mia Carter at Carter's Auto Repair on Route 6 outside Bozeman. I believe I'm about to have intruders attempting to damage or destroy my property. I have reason to believe this is connected to an ongoing extortion situation that is already documented with the sheriff's department. She kept her voice low and steady and gave them the address twice. Please send someone now. I believe the individuals are already on the property. The dispatcher confirmed they were sending units. Mia hung up and called Jack's number. He answered on the first ring. I know, he said. Stay in the office. The line stayed open. She could hear background sounds through it, movement, the low voices of men communicating in short fragments, and she pressed it to her ear and stayed against the wall and waited. What she heard next was not what she'd expected. She'd expected the crash of breaking glass, the sound of the front door being forced, some dramatic physical rupture. Instead, what she heard was voices outside, muffled, she couldn't make out words, and then silence, and then a different sound entirely. Motorcycles. Not the rumble of approaching vehicles. These were already there, she realized, already in position. The sound had been building for 30 seconds, and she hadn't recognized it for what it was, because it had started at the edge of perception and grown steadily the way a sound does when you're hearing more and more sources of it joining together. One engine, then three, then six, then a dozen and counting. The sound wasn't moving, it was stationary surrounding. It was the specific acoustics of multiple motorcycles idling, distributed across multiple positions, creating an envelope of sound that surrounded the property on at least three sides from what she could tell. Through the open phone line, she heard Jack say very clearly to someone who was not her, "Tell them to hold where they are. Nobody moves until I say." And then a different voice from somewhere much closer than the phone, from just outside the garage mail, and raised and carrying an edge of something that wasn't quite panic but was adjacent to it. What the hell is this? Mia moved to the garage door, just to the edge of it, far enough that she could see the front of the building through the row of small windows above the equipment bay. The lot outside was not dark. She hadn't expected that. Somehow in her mind, the scene had been dark-shadowed vehicles, men in the dark, the ambiguity of middle-of-the-night shapes. But the men outside had brought their own light work lights on equipment, and those lights were now illuminating something they had not accounted for. The lot, the access road, the perimeter of the property, it was ringed with motorcycles. Not dozens, more than dozens. She couldn't count them, not from her angle, not in the shifting light. But they were everywhere she could see, parked and idling, their riders sitting in complete stillness. Engines running, not moving, not threatening, just present in a way that was more powerful than any threat. Travis Holt was there. She could see him from the window. He was standing between two large vehicles that she now understood had been intended to haul away equipment, possibly the lifts, possibly the machines, possibly all of it, leave nothing worth reopening the shop for. He was standing very still, looking at the perimeter of motorcycles, and even from this distance, she could read his posture. A man rapidly recalculating a situation that has completely contradicted everything he was told to expect. Two other men were with him, different from the ones before, bigger, the kind of men you hire for specific purposes. They were looking around in different directions, and what she saw in the way they were moving was something she recognized from the way animals move when they realize they are not the ones doing the surrounding. Jack walked out of the garage. Mia hadn't known he was going to do that. She made an involuntary sound, a short intake of breath, and pressed closer to the window. He walked out into the lit lot without hurry hands at his sides, and he stopped about 15 feet from Travis Holt and looked at him. There was a moment of absolute stillness that seemed to last much longer than it was. Then Jack said loud enough to carry, "You came here thinking nobody was going to stand in with her." Travis Holt said something she couldn't hear. "I can't hear you," Jack said without raising his voice. He didn't need to raise it. The quality of his presence carried it. One of the big men shifted his weight, and Ray Kowalski appeared from the left side of the garage, just stepped out of the shadow and stood there, and that stopped the big man's movement completely. Travis Holt said something else louder this time, something with the word lawyer in it, and Jack nodded like this was completely expected and entirely uninteresting. "You're going to want to call that lawyer," Jack said, "but you're not going to want to touch anything that belongs to Mia Carter tonight." Or any other night. The idling engines filled the silence around that statement. Travis Holt looked around at the motorcycles, the real number of them settling into his comprehension, the full weight of how badly his intelligence on this situation had failed him, and something changed in his posture. Not dramatically, not a collapse, just a slow deflation like a tire losing pressure, the kind of change that comes when someone realizes they have walked into something they cannot exit the way they planned. "This isn't over," Travis said. "No," Jack agreed. "It isn't, but tonight is." The sound of police sirens reached them about 90 seconds later, 3 units coming from the highway. Their lights swept across the lot in oscillating blue and red, and Mia watched Travis Holt's face in that strobing light and saw him make a calculation she recognized even from this distance. Travis and his men did not run. Running would have been worse. They stayed where they were, and when the officers arrived, Travis produced identification and adopted the practiced composure of someone who had been in difficult situations before and knew how to perform innocence. But there were 4 vehicles on the property that didn't belong there at 11:30 at night, with equipment that served no legitimate purpose that could be explained quickly. Mia went out through the garage and met the responding officer at the door of the shop. The officer's name was Petrakis. She could see it on his badge, and he took one look at the situation in the lot and put his hand on his radio before he even spoke to her. "Ma'am," he said, "can you tell me what's happening here?" "These men entered my property tonight with equipment I believe was intended to damage or destroy my business," Mia said. She had never been so calm in her life. The calm was not natural. It was manufactured from necessity, but it felt real from the outside, and that was what mattered. "I have a file with your department from 2 weeks ago about a prior incident. I've also been in contact with the State Financial Crimes Division about a connected case. I can give you Detective Walt Briggs's number and Detective Laura Chen's number at the 80s office." Officer Petrakis looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. "You've already been in contact with the AG's office," he said. "Since yesterday," Mia said. He got on his radio. It took 40 minutes for everything to sort itself into the shape that legal situations eventually take when there are enough witnesses and enough officials present. Travis Holt and his 2 associates were detained for questioning. The vehicles were photographed and documented. 3 officers walked the perimeter taking notes, and one of them stopped at the equipment in the largest vehicle and spent a long time photographing it with his phone before he called something in on his radio that she couldn't hear clearly. Jack stood near the garage doors during all of this. He wasn't involved in the police conversations. He'd pulled slightly back, giving Mia the space to be the one talking, which she understood was deliberate and right. But he was there, and every time she glanced in his direction, his eyes were steady and on her, a fixed point in a scene that was otherwise constantly in motion. At some point during the police activity, she noticed that the motorcycles were gone. Not some of them, all of them. The perimeter had dissolved back into the night without her noticing, when as quietly as it had assembled, and now the lot held only police vehicles and the 4 cars that had come with Travis Holt's group, and the night beyond the lot was just dark again. She found Jack standing near the garage side door while an officer took Petrakis' place, running through questions with her. "They left," she said quietly during a moment when Petrakis had stepped away to make a call. "They did what they came to do," Jack said. "Standing witness. Once the police arrived, standing witness was done." "Who were they all?" Mia asked. "I counted Jack. There were a lot of them." "People who came when I called," Jack said. "Men you rode with." "Some of them," Jack said. "Some of them are men who heard what was happening and wanted to be here. Word traveled faster than I expected." He paused. "Your father's name came up a lot in the calls I made. More than I'd anticipated. People remembered him." Mia looked out at the lot. "He would have hated this," she said. "The drama of it. He hated drama. He was the most quietly lived person I've ever known." "Quiet people leave loud marks," Jack said. "They just don't do it on purpose." Officer Petrakis came back. Travis Holt and the 2 men with him were being transported for formal questioning in connection with the prior incident, he told her, and the vehicles and equipment would be held pending investigation. He gave her a card with a case number. He told her she'd hear from the department within 48 hours. When the last police vehicle left the lot, Mia stood alone outside her shop for the first time since before 11 o'clock. The night was cold and very still. The lot lights buzzed. Somewhere down the highway, a truck was running a long, flat stretch, the sound of it receding into distance until it disappeared. She went back inside. Jack came in behind her. Ray and Leon were already there, standing in the waiting room, and Curtis was in the garage checking that nothing had been disturbed. "Nothing touched," Curtis said, coming through the door. "They never got past the lot." Mia sat down on the stool behind the counter. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking now. They hadn't shaken during any of it, not when she called 911, not when she spoke to the officers, not when she was watching Travis Holt from the window. But now, in the aftermath, with the immediate crisis resolved and nothing left to hold herself rigid against her hands, were making small, involuntary movements she couldn't stop. Ray saw it and went to the coffee maker without being asked. He poured a cup and set it in front of her. "It hits you after," he said. "That's normal." "Is it?" Mia Ma asked. "Every time," Ray said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and held it and let the shaking work through her while the four men moved around the waiting room, checking their phones, talking quietly to each other in fragments she wasn't trying to follow. After a few minutes, the shaking stopped. "They're going to tell Voss what happened tonight," Mia said. "Travis Holt, whenever they let him go. He's going to tell Voss that his plan fell apart." "Yes," Jack said. He was standing near the window that faced the lot, looking out at the empty space where the motorcycles had been. "What does Voss do when he hears that?" Jack turned from the window. "He panics," he said, "or he calculates. Voss is a calculator, not a panic person. But even calculators, when they've been miscalculating badly enough for long enough, can end up doing things that look a lot like panic." He sat down. "He's going to try to make this go away. He's going to try to create some kind of arrangement that insulates him from what happened tonight. He's going to try to blame Travis Holt," Mia said. Jack looked at her steadily. "That's exactly what he's going to try to do. He's going to say Travis acted independently, that he had no knowledge, that whatever his employees did was outside the scope." "Yes," Jack said, "which is why the recording matters, which is why the documentation from the other businesses matters. Because if he can successfully position himself as an uninvolved party whose employee went rogue, the whole thing becomes much harder to prosecute." He leaned forward. "Chen needs to move quickly. If she can get to Travis Holt before Voss's lawyer does, before Holt has been given a script, that's the window." Mia looked at her phone. It was 12:47 in the morning. She called Walt Briggs. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been awake and waiting. "I know," Walt said. "Jack already texted me. How are you?" "Fine," Mia said. "Walt, we need Chen to move on Travis Holt before Voss can manage the situation. If she can talk to him tonight." "I already called her," Walt said. "The moment I heard police were on scene. She's aware." A brief pause. Mia, tonight was significant. What happened at that lot, 4 vehicles, that equipment, the timing, that's not ambiguous. That's not something Voss can explain away as a misunderstanding. "He's going to try." "He's going to try," Walt agreed. "But there are police reports now. There are photographs of the equipment. There are officers who can testify to what they found. And there are 40 or 50 witnesses who were on that property who watched it all happen." He paused. "You did good tonight. You held it together." "I had help," Mia said. "That's kind of the point, isn't it?" Walt said. After she hung up, the shop went quiet again. Ray and Leon said their goodnights and left. Curtis shook her hand at the door, a firm, brief grip, and told her she had a good shop. She thanked him and watched him walk to his motorcycle. Jack was the last to leave. He put on his jacket. He picked up his coffee cup, always the coffee cup, always carried, to the trash, and he stood near the door for a moment. "Get some sleep," he said. "I will," Mia said. Then Jack, "Those men tonight, there were so many of them. I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "All right," he said. "Were any of them there because you called in something old? Something from your previous life? Some kind of debt or obligation?" Jack looked at her for a moment. "Some of them were there because they ride, and because when someone in their community says there's a situation that needs people, they come," he said. "That's just how it works in certain circles." He paused. "Some of them were there because they heard your father's name the same way Ray did." Another pause. "And some of them were there because I asked, not because of debt or obligation. Because I asked people I've known for a long time, and when people like that trust each other, asking is usually enough." "None of it was coerced," Mia said. "No one was there because they felt they had to be. No, Jack said simply. Everyone there wanted to be there. That's a different thing. Mia nodded. She believed him. One more question, she said. Travis Holt said it wasn't over. He was right, Jack said. So this isn't the end. Tonight was the turn, Jack said. Everything up until now, Voss was moving and we were responding. Tonight, the direction changed. Now he's the one responding. He buttoned his jacket. That's a different game, and it's one we're better positioned for. He left. Mia locked the doors and stood alone in her father's shop. She walked the garage slowly the way she sometimes did at the end of a hard day, touching things as she passed them, the workbench, the edge of the lift, the pegboard with the wrenches. Her father's handwriting was on the pegboard in the small, neat letters above each grouping of tools, labeling things that anyone would have known, but that Daniel Carter had labeled anyway because he believed in order and in naming things correctly. She stopped in front of the toolbox. The original one, the one she had refused to replace even when everything else needed replacing. It was old and beaten, and it had her father's initials scratched into the top with something sharp, done, at some point she had no memory of because it had happened before she was old enough to notice such things. The scratching was shallow and slightly uneven, the kind of marking a man makes not to show the world something, but to tell himself something. This is mine. This is what I built. This is what I'm responsible for. She put her hand on the toolbox and stood there for a moment. Tonight had changed something, not in the legal situation that was still unresolved, still moving through its slow and complicated machinery. Not in the financial situation, she still had 3 weeks of runway and a precarious set of numbers that hadn't improved overnight. The thing that had changed was harder to name, more internal than any of those things. For 3 weeks, she had been fighting a defensive battle, receiving pressure and resisting it, absorbing attacks and trying to remain standing. It had felt most of that time like treading water, using all her energy just to hold position, making no progress, wearing down. Tonight had been different. Tonight she had stood in the middle of something she had helped create. Not the police response, not the legal architecture Walt was building, but the fact of people showing up. The fact that when Jack called, the answer was yes, and when the answer was yes, it multiplied. And when it multiplied, it became something that Travis Holt, standing in a lit parking lot, could see and understand and recalibrate his entire evening around. She had not created that. Her father had created it 30 years ago, one act of decency at a time, without ever seeming to think of it as building anything. But she had inherited it, and she was starting to understand what that meant. Her phone rang, blocked number. She almost didn't answer, but there was a quality to the timing. It was after 1 a.m, after everything that had happened, that made her pick up. Ms. Carter. The voice was older, controlled, professionally modulated, the voice of someone who was very careful about how they sounded. My name is Gregory Cannon. I'm an attorney. I represent Richard Voss. Mia's hand tightened on the phone. It's 1 a.m, Mr. Cannon. I apologize for the hour, Cannon said. I'm calling because I understand there was an incident at your property tonight, and I want to ensure that there are no misunderstandings about my client's position. Your client's position, Mia said. Mr. Voss is deeply concerned about actions allegedly taken by members of his company without his knowledge or authorization. He wants you to know that he takes these matters extremely seriously and that he is personally committed to. Mr. Cannon, Mia said. It's 1 a.m. I've had a very long night. I'm not going to have this conversation right now. Miss Carter, I simply want to convey. I have a lawyer, Mia said. His name is Walter Briggs. Please call him. She paused. Also, you should know that I've been speaking with Detective Laura Chen at the State AG's office about your client's business practices. If you don't already know who she is, you should find out. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Good night, Mr. Cannon. She hung up. Then she sat very still for a moment, looking at the phone in her hand. Voss's lawyer calling at 1 a.m. was not the action of a man who felt secure. You didn't call at 1 a.m. to assert a comfortable position. You called at 1 a.m. because something had happened that scared you, and you were trying to get ahead of it before the morning brought it more fully into the light. The morning Mia thought was going to be very interesting. She locked up the shop and drove home, and this time, for the first time in weeks, she fell asleep quickly and completely. She didn't dream, or if she did, she didn't remember it. What she didn't know yet, what neither she nor Jack nor Walt Briggs knew, at 1:23 in the morning when she pulled out of the lot, was what was already happening 60 miles away in a corporate office building in Bozeman, in a room where Richard Voss was having a conversation that was going to change everything. Not the conversation with Gregory Cannon, who was sitting across from him at the conference table trying very hard to project calm he did not feel. The conversation happening in the corner of that room in low voices between two people she had never met. One of them was a man named Dale Oren, who worked for Voss as a deputy director of acquisitions and who had until approximately 3 weeks ago believed he was working for a legitimate development company with aggressive but defensible business practices. Dale Oren had been holding something for 3 weeks, a document, specific, dated, bearing Richard Voss's signature. And tonight, sitting in that conference room at 1 a.m, while his employer tried to manage a crisis that was clearly too large for any conference room to contain, Dale Oren had made a decision. He pulled out his phone and sent a text message to a number he had looked up that afternoon. The number belonged to Detective Laura Chen. The text said, "I have documentation you need to see. Can we meet tomorrow morning early?" Chen's reply came back in 4 minutes. 6 a.m. My office. Don't discuss this with anyone else tonight. Dale Oren put his phone in his pocket and looked at Richard Voss across the conference room and thought about everything he'd seen over 3 years of working for this man, and he thought about the shop he'd driven past that morning on his way to a site assessment, a small building with a hand-lettered sign that said Carter's Classic Auto Repair. And he thought about his own father, who had run a small appliance repair store for 27 years before a mall was built nearby and took everything. He sat quietly through the rest of the meeting, and at 6 a.m, he walked into Laura Chen's office with a manila envelope that contained a document bearing Richard Voss's signature dated 14 months ago, authorizing a campaign of business interference against 3 specific properties, including a hardware store in Shelby and a farm supply business in Livingston. Not a memo, not a summary, a signed operational directive. In Voss's own handwriting, in his own words, spelling out exactly what he wanted done and how. Laura Chen read it twice. Then she picked up her phone and made a call to the county district attorney's office. That call, made at 6:17 in the morning, was the beginning of the end for Richard Voss. Mia wouldn't know any of this until later that day, when Walt Briggs called her at the shop with a tone in his voice she hadn't heard before, the specific quality of a controlled man who was working hard not to let satisfaction show and not quite succeeding. But she was already at the shop by then, doors open at 7, coffee on, a 1994 Jeep Cherokee in the first bay with a transmission that needed attention. Mia Carter working the same as every morning, the same as her father before her. The only difference was what was already in motion in the world outside those garage doors. 60 miles away in an office building she'd never been to, the thing that had been built against her was beginning quietly, decisively to come apart. Walt Briggs called at 11:17 in the morning. Mia was under the Cherokee when her phone buzzed on the concrete beside her. She saw Walt's name on the screen, rolled out and answered before the second ring finished. "Tell me," she said. Walt said, "Dale Oren walked into Chen's office at 6 this morning with a signed operational directive from Richard Voss authorizing targeted business interference against at least 3 properties. Dated 14 months ago. Voss's own handwriting on the authorization line." Mia sat on the concrete floor and said nothing for a moment. "A signed directive," she said. "Not a memo. Not a suggestion. An operational directive with specific properties named, specific methods outlined, and Richard Voss's signature at the bottom." Walt's voice was doing that thing where controlled men try to keep satisfaction from coming through and don't entirely succeed. "Chen contacted the DA's office this morning. There's a meeting scheduled for this afternoon." "Who is Dale Oren?" Mia asked. "Deputy Director of Acquisitions at Voss Development. Been there 3 years. Apparently, he's been uncomfortable with certain practices for some time, but convinced himself it was aggressive but legal. Last night changed that calculation for him." "Last night changed a lot of calculations," Mia said. "It did," Walt said. "Mia, I want to be careful about how much I promise you right now. These things take time and there are a lot of moving parts. But what Oren brought in this morning, if it holds up, and Chen seems to believe it will, this is not a case that goes away quietly." "What about Voss's lawyer Cannon called me at 1 a.m? Walt was quiet for half a second. "He called you directly?" 1 a.m, said Voss was deeply concerned about actions taken without his authorization. Walt made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "He's already building the firewall. Travis Holt acted independently, Voss had no knowledge of the whole structure. A pause. Except now there's a document that says otherwise. 14 months of otherwise. Does Cannon know about Oren yet? Mia asked. If he doesn't know now, he will within hours, Walt said. These things travel fast inside an organization when someone pulls the pin. He paused. Here's what I need you to do. Write down everything Cannon said to you last night. Word for word, best as you can remember. Time, tone, the specific language he used. I want a record that he attempted direct contact with you rather than going through representation. Is that significant? It's a mistake, Walt said simply. Good lawyers don't call opposing parties at 1 a.m. They call when they're rattled. I want documentation that Gregory Cannon was rattled at 1 a.m. After she hung up, Mia sat on the concrete for another minute, not moving, not thinking in any coherent sense. Just absorbing. Her hands were still slightly marked with grease from the Cherokee, and she looked at them in an abstract way. These hands that were her father's hands in miniature. The same long fingers, the same calluses in roughly the same places built by the same kind of work over years. She thought about Dale Oren, a man she'd never met sitting in a conference room at 1 a.m, watching his employer try to manage a crisis and making a decision. She thought about what it cost to make that decision, the job, the income, the professional relationships, the sense of complicity that had probably been building for 3 years and had finally become too heavy to carry. She didn't know Dale Oren, but she thought she understood him. People reach moments where continuing to look away cost more than they were willing to pay. Her father had understood that. Her father had never been the kind of man who looked away, and he'd never made a production of it, never announced it, just quietly and consistently failed to look away whenever looking away would have been easier. She got up, went to the sink, washed her hands, and went back to work on the Cherokee. The transmission wasn't going to fix itself. By early afternoon, 3 things had happened that she didn't anticipate. The first was a call from Officer Petrakis, the responding officer from the night before, telling her that Travis Holt and the 2 men who'd been detained for questioning had been formally charged with criminal trespass and possession of tools associated with property destruction, and that the DA's office had indicated additional charges were under review pending the investigation. His voice as he said this had the specific flatness of a professional man who was trying not to editorialize but was finding it difficult. You should also know, Petrakis said, that we got a call this morning from a lawyer named Cannon who wanted to discuss the events of last night. The DA's office took the call. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. They were not particularly receptive. Thank you, Officer Petrakis, Mia said. Carter's Auto Repair, Petrakis said. Your father fixed my patrol car once. County vehicle, bad alternator about 12 years ago. He billed us for parts only. Said he didn't charge for labor on vehicles that serve the public. A brief pause. I always meant to come back and tell him that mattered. Mia pressed her lips together for a moment. I'll pass that along, she said quietly, which was the only thing she could say. The second thing that happened was Frank Dempsey calling from Shelby. Not a 2 a.m. call this time. A daytime call, his voice different in the daylight hours, less tight, more like a man who had slept and eaten and breathed, who had made his decision the night before and had woken up on the other side of it and found it solid. I heard it went all right last night, Frank said. It went all right, Mia confirmed. Good. A pause. I called the 2 other owners, the hotel in Hardin-Della Monroe and the farm supply Tom Kessler. They both want to give formal statements. They'd been waiting for someone to build enough of a structure that their statements would land somewhere that mattered. His voice shifted slightly. Chen's office called me this morning. Her office, not an assistant, not a clerk. Her directly. She's moving fast, Mia said. She said the directive Oren brought in specifically names my property, Frank said. By address, by owner name, with a specific timeline and a specific methodology. His voice was level, but underneath the level there was something Mia recognized as the sound of a man reaching the edge of what he can contain without his voice breaking and holding on just enough. 22 years, Mia. My father started that store before I was born, handed it to me when I was 31. We had the best hardware selection between Billings and Great Falls. People drove 40 minutes to shop there. He stopped for a moment. Voss named my store in a document like it was a chess piece. Frank, Mia said. I know, he said. I know, it's done now. I needed to say that. A breath. Chen says we're what she needed, the three of us plus you. Four separate properties, same methodology documented. That's a pattern that a jury can follow. It won't bring your store back, Mia said. No, Frank said, but it might mean he can't do it to the next person. And that's worth something. A pause. Your father would have made the same call, I think, reaching out to warn someone even when you can't fix your own situation. Yeah, Mia said, he would have, Emma. The third thing that happened in the early afternoon was the one she had least expected. Richard Voss called her himself. Not through Cannon, not through Travis Holt, or a deputy, or an intermediary. Richard Voss, whose number she had never had before, and whose voice she had never heard, called her personal cell phone at 2:14 in the afternoon. She almost let it go to voicemail. She had her hand hovering over the decline button, and then she thought about what Walt had said about Cannon calling at 1 in the morning, that it was the action of a rattled man, and she thought about what it meant that Voss himself was calling, now mid-afternoon, presumably, while his lawyer was somewhere trying to prevent exactly this. She answered. Miss Carter. The voice surprised her. She'd constructed a version of Richard Voss in her mind over the past weeks built from Travis Holt's face and Gregory Cannon's measured phone manner, and the deliberate cruelty of what had been done to her, and to Frank Dempsey, and to Della Monroe, and to Tyne Kessler, and the voice she'd imagined was commanding and cold. The actual voice was older than she'd expected, and underneath its professional surface, she could hear something she hadn't anticipated. Not remorse, not guilt, something more naked than either of those poorly managed, bleeding through at the edges of otherwise careful words. I'd like to speak with you directly. You're speaking with me, Mia said. I want you to know that what happened at your property last night was not authorized by me in any way. Travis Holt made decisions that went far beyond his role, and I intend to, Mr. Voss, Mia said. I'm going to stop you there. A pause. 14 months ago, Mia said you signed a document authorizing targeted business interference against Carter's Classic Auto Repair, among other properties. That document is currently in the possession of Detective Laura Chen at the State Attorney General's office. The silence on the other end of the line had a specific quality, not empty, full of a man rapidly processing information and finding that it did not produce a manageable outcome. I don't know what document you're referring to, Voss said, and his voice had shifted. The fear was less well managed now. The one with your signature on the authorization line, Mia said. The one that your former deputy director of acquisitions brought to Chen's office this morning. A pause. Mr. Voss, I'm going to do what I probably should have done 30 seconds ago, which is tell you that you should not be talking to me right now. You should be talking to your lawyer. And your lawyer, when you reach him, is going to tell you that calling me was a significant mistake, and he will be right. She paused one more time. Don't call me again. She hung up. Then she sat down on the stool behind the counter because her legs had made a unilateral decision that standing was not currently an option. Her heart was hitting hard in her chest, not from fear, but from the specific adrenaline of having said exactly what needed to be said in exactly the right sequence to exactly the right person at exactly the right moment, and knowing it and knowing that it had landed. She called Walt. Voss just called me directly, she said. I told him about Orrin and the document. Then I told him to call his lawyer and hung up. Walt was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. He called you himself. 2:14 p.m. Another 3 seconds. His lawyer is going to be beside himself. That was my impression, Mia said. Did you record it? She closed her eyes briefly. No, I didn't think to. It's okay, Walt said. You said nothing incriminating and you handled it correctly. Did you tell him to call his lawyer? Explicitly. Good, that matters. Walt paused. Mia, when a man like Voss calls the person he's been working to destroy and tries to manage the situation himself, that means the people he's paying to manage it are failing. It means the situation is getting away from the people he trusts, and he's reverting to what he knows, which is direct control. A brief pause. He's scared, and scared people make mistakes. He already made one today, Mia said. He made several, Walt said. But yes, this one is on the list. Jack came in at 4. Not his usual Wednesday morning visit. Just present the way he'd been present all week, appearing when the situation called for it, with no more drama than a man dropping in for coffee. Mia told him everything Petrakis's call, Frank Dempsey Voss calling directly. Jack listened without interrupting. When she finished, he poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and was quiet for a moment. Voss called you, he said. Yes. That's a man who doesn't trust the people he's hired to protect him, Jack said, which means one of two things. Either he knows his people have already failed and he's trying to take control, or he's been told something that made him realize the situation is worse than he thought, and he's panicking and going over everyone's heads. Orrin, Maya said. When Cannon told him about Orrin this morning, that's what broke the dam, Jack said, nodding slowly. He can throw Travis Holt to the lawyers and make it stick, maybe. Employees acting outside their authority. That's a defensible position with the right judge and enough resources. But a signed document in his own hand, naming your property specifically, he shook his head. That's not a defense. That's a confession with a date on it. Can he claim the document means something different than it looks like it means? Mia asked. Cannon will try, Jack said. That's what Cannon does. He'll contextualize it, argue about the language, try to establish that business interference means something more ambiguous than what it obviously means. He picked up his cup. But Walt says the farm supply and the hardware store followed exactly the methodology described in the document. Specific timelines, specific tactics. That's not ambiguity, that's instruction, followed by execution. And 4 owners who can testify to the pattern. 4 owners, Jack confirmed, plus Orrin's testimony about how that document was created and what was understood about it inside the company. He looked at her directly. This case is going to be built properly. It's going to take time to build it properly, but it's going to be built. Mia looked at him. You knew it was going to come to this when you started making calls, didn't you? You already saw the full shape of it. Jack was quiet for a moment. I saw the possibility, he said. When you isolate someone, you need them to stay isolated for it to work. The moment they connect with other people who've experienced the same thing, the isolation breaks. And when the isolation breaks, the whole methodology becomes visible. That's always the weakness in what men like Voss do. He paused. They depend on people feeling alone. They don't have a plan for when they don't. Mia nodded slowly. She thought about Frank Dempsey saying we weren't alone, we just didn't know it, and how those 7 words had hit her at 2 a.m. like something physical. My father, she said, he built connections just by being decent, not strategically, not because he was planning for something, just because that's who he was. She paused. And it turns out that's the one thing Voss couldn't account for. The one variable he didn't know existed. Unintentional networks are the hardest to attack, Jack said, because they're not built around any single point. They're built around a quality, a reputation, a way of being. He set down his cup. You can threaten a person. You can pressure a business. You can buy out a location, but you can't buy out 30 years of people remembering that someone was good to them. They sat with that for a moment. Then Mia said, I need to tell you something about the financial situation, because the legal case moving forward doesn't change the numbers I'm running right now. Tell me, Jack said. I did the books last night after everything settled down. I have roughly 2.5 weeks of operating runway before I hit a wall. The customer recovery has helped. We're back to about 80% of where we were before Voss started the supplier campaign. But 80% isn't enough to cover everything without dipping into reserves I don't actually have. Jack absorbed this without visible reaction. What's the gap? She told him the number. It was not a large number in the context of corporate development or legal cases or the kind of operations Richard Voss ran. It was a real number for a small shop in Montana. It was the number between staying open and closing. Jack nodded once. That's manageable, he said. Jack, listen to me for a minute, he said. Ray Kowalski has a nephew who needs fleet maintenance done for his landscaping business. 12 vehicles, oil changes, and inspections quarterly contract. Ray mentioned it yesterday. He's been looking for a local shop and has been using someone in Billings because nobody local gave him a good enough offer. That would be Leon Marsh. Jack continued like he was working through a list he had already made. Has a brother-in-law who manages a construction company and 8 trucks, same situation. And there's a woman named Barbara Chen, not related to the detective, who owns a taxi service in town, 7 vehicles, and whose current mechanic is retiring in 6 weeks. Mia stared at him. You've already been talking to people about this. I've been talking to people about this for 3 days, Jack said simply. You didn't tell me. I wanted to have something concrete before I told you, he said. Talking about possibilities when someone's under financial pressure doesn't help. Having actual offers to discuss, that's different. Mia looked at him for a long moment. There was something she kept running into with Jack. Callahan kept encountering at new angles something she hadn't had a word for until now. It was the quality of someone who helped the way her father had helped, not from a desire to be seen helping, not from sentiment, not because it was dramatic or satisfying, but because there was a thing that needed doing, and they were in a position to do it, and so they did it without announcement. There's something else, Jack said. His tone shifted just enough that she felt it. There are people who want to help with the equipment, he said, the diagnostic machine that was destroyed. It's not a small cost, I know that. It's not something I can replace right now, Mia said. There's a man named Gerald Park who retired 2 years ago from a dealership group in Billings. He has a diagnostic unit newer than the one you lost that he's been storing because he didn't know what to do with it after the dealership closed. He heard about what happened here. Jack paused. He wants to loan it, indefinitely, until you're in a position where you can think about replacing it yourself. Mia opened her mouth and then closed it. He didn't know my father, she said finally. No, Jack said. He heard about him. There's a difference, but it's smaller than you'd think. The afternoon light had shifted while they talked, gone from flat mid-afternoon to the lower, more golden quality of late afternoon, and the shop around them was very quiet and very present. She'd grown up in this shop. She'd learned to use every tool on that pegboard in this shop. She'd heard her father talk to customers in this shop, heard him explain things clearly and honestly and without condescension, heard him refuse payment when he felt someone couldn't afford it and accept it gratefully when they could. She'd absorbed all of it without knowing she was absorbing it the way children absorb everything around them completely, without effort, without knowing it's happening, until someday they find themselves in a situation where they reach for something they need and discover they already have it. Her father had never talked to her about legacy. He'd been too practical for that kind of language. He'd talked about work. He'd talked about doing the job right. He'd talked about treating people the way you'd want your daughter to be treated, which was the closest he ever came to philosophy. But she understood now in a way she couldn't have articulated to him while he was alive, that all of it had been about legacy. Every oil change done honestly, every estimate given accurately, every bill that came in below what it could have been, every stranger helped on a roadside, every customer who was told the truth even when the truth was expensive. It had all been about this, about building something that would last beyond him. Not a building, not a business. Something that lived in the people who'd been touched by it. And that thing, that invisible inheritance, had just saved his daughter's shop. She was thinking all of this when her phone rang again. Walt Briggs, she answered immediately. The DA's office had their meeting with Chen, Walt said. 45 minutes ago. I just got off the phone with her. A pause. They're moving forward. Formal investigation, multiple counts. The directive document is being authenticated as we speak. She said, and this is Chen, who doesn't give away much. She said it was the clearest pattern of organized business fraud she'd seen in 18 years on the job. Mia let out a breath. When does something formal happen to Voss? Chen said days, not weeks. The document changes the timeline significantly. Without it, you're building a circumstantial case and arguing about what individual employees did and whether Voss knew. With it, Walt paused. With it, you don't have to argue. He told you. In writing, with a date and a signature. Cannon is going to fight it, Mia said. Cannon is going to fight it brilliantly, Walt said. He's an excellent lawyer, but there are things even excellent lawyers cannot do, and making a signed operational directive disappear is one of them. A pause. There's something else, Chen told me. Dale Oren wasn't the only person in that organization who had concerns. When Oren walked in this morning, he gave Chen 2 other names. People who'd witnessed specific conversations, specific decisions, specific moments where what Voss was doing crossed a line that even the people working for him could see clearly. Chen's people are reaching out to both of them today. He's losing his own organization, Mia said. He lost it last night, Walt said quietly. When the plan failed and Travis Holt got detained and Voss had to call his lawyer at midnight, everyone in that company who'd been looking the other way had to decide whether they were still willing to look the other way, and some of them decided they weren't. After the call, Mia put her phone down and stood at the counter and tried to organize what she was feeling into something manageable. It didn't organize itself tidily. What she felt was tangled and contradictory, relief and exhaustion and grief and something that was almost anger, the delayed kind, the kind that comes when the crisis passes and you finally have space to be furious about what was done to you. Jack was watching her from across the shop. "You okay?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said, which was the honest answer. "That's reasonable," he said. She walked to the workbench. She needed to do something with her hands. She picked up a wrench and turned it over and set it back. 3 weeks, she said. "For 3 weeks, I've been getting up every morning and coming in here and opening those doors and trying to act like everything was normal. When someone was deliberately trying to erase what my father built, and I couldn't stop it. I could only slow it down, hold my ground, take the hits. And the whole time I kept thinking there has to be a moment when the tide turns. There has to be a point where it starts going the other direction." She stopped. "And I think it already happened. I think it turned when those bikes showed up last night, and I didn't even know until this morning." "It turned before that," Jack said. She looked at him. "It turned the night you decided not to sell," Jack said. "The rest of it was just other people catching up to a decision you'd already made." She didn't have an answer for that. She turned back to the workbench. What she didn't know yet, and what was about to arrive in the form of a very specific phone call, was that Richard Voss, in the hours since she'd told him to call his lawyer and hung up, had been doing something that no one who knew him had predicted. He had not been following Gregory Cannon's advice. He had been making his own calculations, and those calculations had led him somewhere that Cannon, when he found out about it 2 hours later, would describe to a colleague as the single worst strategic decision he had witnessed in 30 years of criminal defense law. At 4:47 in the afternoon, Richard Voss walked into the county sheriff's office without his lawyer, without calling ahead. He told the duty sergeant that he wanted to make a voluntary statement about the events of the previous evening at Carter's Auto Repair. He said, and these were the exact words that the duty sergeant would later recall under oath, that he wanted to set the record straight before things got further out of hand. He was taken to an interview room. He was advised of his rights. He waived them, and then Richard Voss, CEO of Voss Development Group with assets across 3 counties and 15 years of successful property acquisitions, behind him began to talk. He talked for 2 hours and 19 minutes. He was trying to tell his version. He was trying to establish that Travis Holt had acted beyond his authority. He was trying to position himself as a businessman who had been betrayed by an overzealous employee. But Richard Voss was not a lawyer. He was a developer. He was accustomed to rooms where he held all the leverage. He was not accustomed to rooms where 2 quiet detectives asked the simple questions and let the silence after each answer stretch just long enough to make him fill it with more words than he intended. By the time Gregory Cannon found out what was happening and arrived at the sheriff's office, demanding to see his client, Richard Voss had answered enough questions to transform Dale Orn's document from a powerful piece of evidence into a piece of evidence that the man himself had now partially corroborated. Cannon got his client out of the interview room in under 10 minutes. But those 2 hours and 19 minutes already existed. They were recorded. They were on the record. And they were, as Walt Briggs would tell Mia the next morning with a flatness in his voice that she now recognized as his version of barely contained astonishment and extraordinary gift. That evening, just before she locked up, Mia went to her father's toolbox. She opened the top drawer. Inside, among the small things that accumulated in a toolbox over years, spare bolts, a broken pencil, a pocket flashlight with dead batteries, was a photograph. She'd known it was there. She'd known it for years. But she hadn't looked at it closely since her father died, because looking at it closely had always cost more than she could afford on an ordinary day. She picked it up now. Her father, maybe 40 years old in the photo, maybe a little less, standing in front of this shop, squinting slightly in the sun, not smiling exactly. Her father was not a natural smiler for photographs, but with an expression that was satisfied and present and completely himself. He was holding a wrench in one hand, the way other men hold a drink at a party casually, like it belonged there. Behind him, slightly out of focus, was the sign above the garage door. Carter's Classic Auto Repair. Mia looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she put it back in the drawer, closed the toolbox, picked up her keys, and turned off the lights. Outside, the evening was clear and cold, the sky already going to that deep Montana blue that happened between sunset and dark, the specific blue of immense distance of space that exists without reference to human scale. She locked the front door. She turned around and looked at the building from the lot. Her father's sign, her father's building, her father's life's work, which had become her life's work, which had survived 3 weeks of systematic assault by a man who had made the mistake of believing that what mattered about a business was its physical and financial existence. He hadn't understood what the business actually was. What the business actually was the reason that Jack Callahan came on Wednesday mornings. The reason Ray Kowalski drove across town in a truck with a mismatched door. The reason Frank Dempsey called at 2 in the morning. The reason Gerald Park wanted to loan a diagnostic machine to someone he'd never met. The reason police officers mentioned alternators repaired 12 years ago. The reason Dale Oren made a decision in a conference room at 1 in the morning that had just handed the state of Montana a case they'd been trying to build for 18 months. The business was all of that, and it was still standing. Mia walked to her car. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, the doors would open. Tonight, somewhere in Bozeman, Richard Voss was sitting across from Gregory Cannon, learning what 2 hours and 19 minutes of unadvised voluntary statements looked like when they were played back to you by your own attorney. And in the office of the county a prosecutor named Helen Marsh was reading a transcript and making notes in the margin with a red pen and thinking about timelines and charges and what a signed directive plus a voluntary corroborating statement plus 4 victim testimonies plus 2 internal witnesses added up to. It added up to a case. It added up to the beginning of the end of Richard Voss's ability to look at something someone else built and decide he could simply take it. Mia did not know all the details yet. She would learn them in pieces over the coming days, each piece arriving through Walt or Jack or Chen's office, assembling themselves into a picture that became clearer and more complete with each addition. But driving home that evening in the specific quiet of after the crisis, after the fear, after the longest 3 weeks of her life, she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since the night 3 men walked through her garage doors with a pipe and a message. Not peace, exactly. Not yet. There was too much still in motion for peace, but the ground felt solid under her in a way it hadn't for weeks, and that for now was enough. The call from Walt Briggs came on a Thursday morning 9 days after Richard Voss walked into the sheriff's office and spent 2 hours and 19 minutes handing prosecutors the case they needed. Mia was under a Ford Ranger with a bad rear axle seal when her phone buzzed on the concrete. She saw Walt's name rolled out and answered standing up because something in the frequency of his calls had trained her body to respond to them differently than other calls. Walt Briggs called with information. He did not call to chat. "It's done," Walt said. 2 words. She stood very still. "Voss was formally charged this morning," Walt continued. 7 counts. Organized business fraud, criminal conspiracy, extortion, and 2 additional counts related specifically to the incident at your property. The DA's office filed at 9 a.m. Chen called me 20 minutes ago. Mia put her free hand flat against the side of the Ranger and kept it there. 7 counts, she said. The signed directive was the spine of it, Walt said. Everything else built from that. The 4 victim testimonies. The 2 internal witnesses, the recordings, Frank Dempsey had the statement, Voss made voluntarily before Cannon could stop him. All of it scaffolded around a document that Richard Voss signed with his own hand 14 months ago, naming your property specifically. A pause. Cannon is filing motions already. He'll fight every single count. That's his job, and he'll do it well. But the DA's office went into this with their eyes open, and they built it carefully. Helen Marsh doesn't charge what she can't prove. What about Travis Holt? Mia asked. Holt took a deal this morning. 30 days ago, he was trying to intimidate you into selling. This morning, he sat in a room with a prosecutor and told them everything about how the targeting decisions were made, who gave the orders, what the communication chain looked like, from Voss down to the men who showed up at your shop that first night. Walt's voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath it. The particular satisfaction of someone who has spent weeks carefully assembling something and is now watching it hold. Travis Holt is not a loyal man. He was loyal to Richard Voss exactly as long as Richard Voss could protect him. The moment that protection evaporated, so did the loyalty. Mia was quiet for a moment. And Voss, what happens to him now? Now his lawyers file motions and delay, and contextualize and do everything expensive lawyers do to manage a situation like this. Walt said, the machine moves slowly, but it moves. With what they have, what we help build, it's moving in one direction. Toward accountability, Mia said. Toward accountability, Walt confirmed. After she hung up, Mia stood beside the Ranger for a long moment without moving. The garage was quiet around her. Gerald Park's diagnostic machine sat on the bench where the old one had been newer and more capable, loaned by a man she still hadn't met in person, the machine that had allowed her to take on jobs she'd had to turn away before. The pegboard behind it had her father's wrenches in their ascending order of size, unchanged and unchangeable. She should have felt something larger than what she felt. She'd been waiting for this call in some form for weeks, and now it had come, and the feeling it produced was not the dramatic release she'd imagined, but something quieter and more complicated. Not anticlimax exactly. More like the feeling of setting down something very heavy after carrying it so long that you've forgotten the weight was not a natural condition of your body. You set it down, and what you feel first is not relief, but strangeness. The absence of what you'd been holding. She went to the waiting room and poured herself coffee and sat in the chair that Jack sat in on Wednesday mornings. She sat there for 10 minutes and drank the coffee and let everything settle. Then she picked up the phone and called Jack. He answered on the second ring. Voss was charged this morning, she said. 7 counts. Walt just called. Pause on the other end. Not long. Jack processed things quickly and quietly without visible machinery. Good boy, he said. 7 counts, Mia said again because she was still feeling the weight of it. Is that more or fewer than you expected? Jack asked. I didn't let myself expect anything specific, Mia said. You told me not to. I told you to focus on what you could control, Jack said. Which you did. A pause. How do you feel? Mia looked around the waiting room. The new coffee maker on the counter, the replacement for the one they'd destroyed, same position as the old one, because some things should stay where they've always been. The chairs that customers sat in while they waited, the same chairs her father had bought when the shop first opened. Reupholstered once in the mid-90s and never again. The magazine rack in the corner that always had issues from 3 months ago because she kept forgetting to replace them, which her father had also forgotten, which meant the magazine rack had probably never in its history contained a current issue of anything. Like my father would have known exactly what to say right now, she said, and I have no idea what it would have been. Jack was quiet for a moment. He'd have probably said something practical, he said, something about the work. He wasn't a man who dwelled. No, Mia said, he was really not. Neither are you, Jack said. You've got a Ranger in the bay with a bad axle seal. She almost laughed. Almost. How do you know that? Ray told me his nephew dropped it off this morning. The fleet contract with the Ray's nephew had started 2 weeks ago. 12 vehicles, quarterly maintenance schedule. It had not saved the shop single-handedly, but it had changed the math from precarious to manageable, which was all she'd needed. Come in Wednesday, Mia said. I'll have coffee on. I'll be there, Jack said. She went back to the Ranger. The axle seal wasn't going to fix itself, and the law was going to do what the law did at the speed the law moved, and Richard Voss's fate was in the hands of people who were better positioned to determine it than she was. Her position was here, under this truck, doing the work that needed doing. Her father had always understood that. The work was the answer, not in a simplistic way, not in the way people say it as a deflection. Just work hard and everything will be fine, which was not true and had never been true. In a more specific way, the work was the proof. Every car that left this shop running correctly was evidence of what she was. Every honest estimate, every bill that was what she'd said it would be, every extra half hour spent on a job because it needed that half hour and the customer hadn't budgeted for it, all of it was evidence. Not for any court, just for the record that exists between a person and the way they've chosen to live. That was what her father had built. She was 3 hours into the axle seal when the next thing happened. Della Monroe arrived. Mia knew Della Monroe by name, only the owner of the hotel in Hardin, that Voss had taken one of the 4 victims, whose testimony had contributed to the case. They'd spoken once on the phone, briefly coordinated by Walt when he was gathering statements. Mia had heard in Della's voice the same specific quality she'd heard in Frank Dempsey's voice, the voice of someone who has been carrying something expensive for a long time and is not yet sure they're allowed to put it down. She was in her mid-60s, gray-haired, wearing a canvas jacket and work boots. The kind of woman who moved like she'd spent her life doing physical things and had not slowed down much. She came into the shop with the directness of someone who had decided to come here and was not going to waste the trip. "Ms. Carter," she said, "I'm Della Monroe." Mia wiped her hands and came forward. "I know who you are," she said. "I'm glad you're here." They shook hands with the particular firmness of people who have been through the same thing and recognize it in each other. "I drove up from Hardin this morning," Della said. "I heard the news about the charges. I don't entirely know why I needed to come here specifically. I just did." "I understand that," Mia said. She gestured toward the waiting room. "Coffee." They sat in the waiting room and Mia poured 2 cups and they talked for an hour, and it was one of the most specific conversations she'd ever had, the kind that can only happen between people who have experienced the same thing from the same angle and can therefore skip entirely past the parts that require explanation. Della had owned her hotel for 19 years. Not a large hotel, 18 rooms, a small restaurant attached, the kind of place that served a specific community and knew its regulars by name. Voss had targeted it because the land was adjacent to a parcel he was assembling for a resort development, and a 19-room independent hotel run by a 60-something woman alone was in Voss's assessment the path of least resistance. He'd been right about the path of least resistance. He'd been wrong about least resistance, meaning no resistance. "I sold because I was alone," Della said. "I had no one to call, no lawyer I could afford, no network. I thought I was fighting a corporation with resources I couldn't match." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "What I didn't know was that what I needed wasn't resources. It was connection. People." She looked at Mia directly. "You had Jack Callahan." "My father had Jack Callahan," Mia corrected gently. "I inherited him." Della smiled at that, and the smile changed her face into something that was clearly closer to her natural state than the controlled expression she'd arrived with. "Your father fixed someone's car a long time ago. Mine fixed a broken porch railing for our elderly neighbor when I was 9 years old. He never charged her. He said she was on a fixed income and the railing was a safety issue, and you don't charge for safety." She paused. "I thought about that a lot during what Voss did to me. I thought about how my father would have handled it. I think he would have handled it better than I did." "I don't know if I handled it better than you did," Mia said. "I had things you didn't have. I had warning. I had time. I had Jack showing up on Wednesday mornings for months before any of it started." "That's not nothing," Della said. "No," Mia agreed. "It's everything." Della left 2 hours later after she'd seen the shop after Mia had shown her the pegboard with her father's wrenches and the toolbox with the initials scratched into the top, the thing she showed people now when she wanted them to understand what the shop actually was. Della had stood in front of the toolbox and been quiet for a moment, and then nodded the nod of someone who understood without needing it explained. At the door, Della turned back. "I'm thinking about starting over," she said. "Different property, smaller maybe, I'm not sure yet." She paused. "I'm not sure I have the courage." "You drove from Hardin to Bozeman on the day the charges were filed," Mia said. "That's what courage looks like, the rest of it follows." Della looked at her for a moment, and whatever she saw seemed to settle something in her. She left. Mia went back to the Ranger. The next 48 hours moved in pieces, Walt called with updates as they came. Cannon's first motions filed, the DA's office response procedural details. That meant something to lawyers, and filtered down to her as a general sense of things moving steadily in the direction they needed to move. Chen's office called directly once asking her to confirm specific dates for the formal record, and Chen's voice was precise and professional and gave nothing away, which was exactly who she'd revealed herself to be throughout, and which Mia had come to trust absolutely. Frank Dempsey called on Friday afternoon. "Tom Kessler wants to know if we can all meet," Frank said. "The 4 of us, you, me, Della, Tom, not for anything legal, just to meet. In person." He paused. "I think we all need to see each other in the same room." "Yes," Mia said immediately. "Name the place and I'll be there." They met on a Saturday midday at a diner in Livingston that Tom Kessler had suggested because it was roughly equidistant for all 4 of them, and because the owner was an old friend of his who would give them a back booth without crowding them. Mia drove the 90 minutes with the windows down because the weather had shifted in the past week, gone from the cold edge of early spring to something that felt more genuinely like approaching warmth. The kind of change in Montana that you don't trust right away, because it's been taken back before, but that felt real this time. She was the last to arrive. Tom Kessler was a man in his early 70s, heavy-set and deliberate in his movements, with a weathered directness that reminded her of Jack. Frank Dempsey looked different in person than she'd imagined, from his phone voice smaller, quieter, with careful eyes that watched everything. Della Monroe she recognized immediately, the same directness, the same boots. They shook hands around the table and ordered coffee and food, and then for a moment nobody said anything, because the specific thing they were all in the same room for didn't require an announcement. Tom Kessler spoke first. "I had that farm supply store for just 31 years, he said. Not preamble, not setup, just the facts stated with the weight it carried. My father's before that. We had the best seed selection in 3 counties at one point. Farmers came from an hour away because they knew we'd have what they needed and we'd know what we were talking about." He looked at his coffee cup. "I sold it for 60% of what it was worth because I was exhausted and I thought I was alone and I couldn't see a way through." He paused. "I've been angry about that for 2 years, not just at Voss, at myself for not finding a way." "You couldn't have found a way, sir," Frank said. "I've said the same thing to myself for 3 years. But Voss is specifically good at making you feel like you should have found a way when in fact he's built a system that prevents you from finding one." "That's what Chen said," Della added. "She said his methodology is specifically designed to make each victim feel like a personal failure rather than a target in a pattern. Isolated, like you made bad decisions that led to a predictable outcome rather than being deliberately destroyed by someone with resources and intent." Tom looked at Mia. "You were the one who didn't sell," he said, not an accusation. An observation with something in it that was partly curiosity and partly something more personal. "I got lucky," Maya said. "Jack Callahan happened to be in my waiting room." "That's not luck," Frank said. "That's 30 years of your father treating people right." "Maybe both," Mia said. "But I want to be honest about it. I didn't do something you couldn't do. The situation I was in was genuinely different. I had warning. I had someone with knowledge and connections who stepped in early. If Jack hadn't been there..." She stopped for a moment. "If Jack hadn't been there, I think I'd be sitting at this table having sold my shop." Tom Kessler looked at her directly. "Does that change how it feels, knowing you held on?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "it doesn't change how it feels. It changes how I think about what it means." A pause. "I used to think holding on was about the building, the business, the financial survival of it, and that matters, it matters practically. But the part I kept coming back to, the reason I couldn't make myself sell, even when the numbers were bad, and I was scared it was my father. The idea that someone would take what he'd built and I wouldn't have fought for it, that I'd have been the last person in our family to hold it, and I'd let it go when it got hard." She looked around the table. "I understand now that you all felt the same thing, and I understand that feeling it doesn't mean you failed when you sold. It means Voss found your limit. Voss is very good at finding limits." "But not yours," Frank said. "Not this time," Maya said. "I don't know what my limit would have been if things had gone differently." The food came. They ate and talked, and something happened around that table over the course of an hour and a half that Mia hadn't expected, something that was less about what they said and more about the fact of being in the same physical space. 4 people who had been through the same deliberate destruction from different angles, who had each felt the particular loneliness of fighting a battle that no one else seemed to see. The loneliness was less in person. You couldn't be lonely in the same way when the people who'd felt what you felt were sitting across from you eating soup and talking about farms and hardware stores and a hotel with 18 rooms where the regulars knew their names. At some point, Frank said, "What do you think happens to people like Voss? Even if he's convicted, even if he loses everything legally, do they change?" Nobody answered right away. Then Tom said, "I think some people look at what other people have built and feel something that isn't admiration. They feel a kind of," he searched for the word, "hunger, not for the specific thing, for the having of it, for the taking of it." A pause. "And I don't think that changes. I think it just finds new outlets, or it gets stopped by walls it can't get past." "We're building the wall," Della said quietly. "That's right," Frank said. "We're the wall." Mia drove home from Livingston in the late afternoon, the light going golden and long across the hills, Montana, doing the thing it did in early spring where the landscape seemed to breathe differently than it did in winter, more open, more awake. She thought about what Frank had said. We're the wall, the four of them, plus Walt, plus Chen, plus Jack, and the people Jack had called who'd assembled in her parking lot on a night that felt both very recent and very long ago. All of it built from a mechanic in Bozeman who fixed a gasket for a man who had no money and wouldn't take payment. She thought about how much of what mattered was invisible, how much of it was built in moments that seemed small when they were happening. Her father driving 40 minutes at 9 o'clock at night to help a pregnant woman on a roadside. Not because anyone was watching, not because it built anything, because there was a person who needed help and he had the ability to help, and that was the entire calculation. 30 years of that calculation. And when his daughters needed standing, with the answer to that calculation was everywhere she turned. The following Wednesday, Jack arrived at 7:45 with his Harley and his paperback and sat in his chair in the waiting room. Mia had the coffee ready. She poured him a cup without being asked and went back to the car she was working on, which was a 2003 Camry with a persistent idle problem that had resisted 2 previous attempts at diagnosis. They were quiet for a while in the way that people are quiet when they've been through something together and the something has resolved and they're on the other side of it and the quiet is no longer the quiet of waiting. It was the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday morning in a working shop. Around 9 o'clock, Ray Kowalski's nephew Derek came in to drop off 2 vehicles from the fleet for their quarterly check. He was 26, eager and practical, the kind of young man who shook hands firmly and got to the point and clearly ran his landscaping business the way his Uncle Ray approached most things directly without drama. Mia walked him through what she'd found on the previous service, what she was watching on the current one, what he should expect on timeline and cost. He nodded and asked good questions and left looking satisfied. Jack watched this from the waiting room. When Derek left, Jack said, "Your father would have liked him." "He would have," Mia agreed. "He liked anyone who asked good questions and didn't talk over the answers." Sometime around 10, Gerald Park called. She'd been speaking with him occasionally since the diagnostic machine had arrived, and she'd finally met him in person. Twice a quiet retired man in his early 70s who had spent 40 years in the dealership business and who, when she tried to express proper gratitude for the loan of the machine, had waved it off with the specific impatience of someone who finds formal thanks embarrassing. "Just checking that the unit is behaving itself," Gerald said. "Better than my old one," Mia said. "I ran a diagnosis last week on a transmission issue that the old machine would have taken 3 passes to catch. This one got it in 1. "Good," Gerald said. He sounded pleased in the understated way he sounded about most things. "I was thinking about something, Mia. If you ever want to talk about the business side of things, growth fleet contracts, commercial accounts. I spent a lot of years building that business from the dealership side. Different industry, but similar mechanics. I'd be happy to sit down with you." "I'd like that," Mia said, genuinely. After she hung up, she stood at the counter for a moment and thought about how the shop around her had changed in the past few weeks. Not physically, the bones of it were her father's bones unchanged, but the texture of it had changed. The fleet contracts meant the shop was busier in a more regular, predictable way. The word of mouth that Jack had seeded had taken on a life of its own. Customers referring other customers, because that was what happened when you did the work right and treated people honestly. She'd had to start scheduling 2 weeks out, which had never happened before in the shop's history. The financial runway that had been 3 weeks in either direction was now comfortable in a way she hadn't experienced since she had taken over. Not prosperous, comfortable, sustainable. There was a difference between those things, and she was clear on what it was. She was thinking about this when the door to the shop opened and a woman walked in who Mia didn't recognize at first. She was in her early 40s, well-dressed, without being overdressed, with the particular purposefulness of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it before they can talk themselves out of it. She stopped just inside the door and said, "Is this Carter's Auto Repair?" "It is," Mia said. "My name is Sandra Voss," the woman said. The name landed in the shop like something dropped on concrete. Sandra Voss. Mia looked at her and saw it immediately. There was something in the structure of the face, the line of the awe, and she understood before Sandra said another word. "Richard Voss is my father," Sandra said. The shop was very quiet. Jack looked up from his book. He didn't stand. He just became more present the way he did when a situation required his full attention without requiring his physical involvement. Mia kept her expression level. "Okay," she said. I'm not here on his behalf, Sandra said quickly, and the quickness of it told Mia that she'd anticipated exactly that interpretation and needed to correct it immediately. I'm not representing him. I'm not here to ask you anything or offer you anything, or I'm here because I needed to come here. Because I've known for 2 years that my father was doing something wrong, and I couldn't make myself acknowledge what I knew. And then everything happened, and she stopped. She pressed her lips together and controlled something that was moving close to the surface. I just needed to see this place. I needed to see what he tried to take. Mia looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you want coffee?" Sandra Voss blinked. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." Mia poured it. Sandra sat in the waiting room, not in Jack's chair. She took the one on the other side of the small table, as if some instinct told her which seat wasn't available, and held the cup in both hands and looked at the floor. "He taught me that the point of business was acquisition," Sandra said. "He used that word specifically. Acquisition. Identify what you want. Determine the path of least resistance. Acquire it." She paused. "I spent 20 years thinking that was wisdom. I went into real estate myself because of it. I was very successful by his definition." She looked up at Mia, and then I started noticing things. When I visited certain properties, he was acquiring who was there, how they looked, what they'd built. I started asking questions he didn't answer well. Another pause. I stopped asking questions because the answers scared me. "But you knew," Mia said. "I knew," Sandra confirmed. "Not the specifics, but I knew the general shape of it, that he was taking things from people who'd built them. And I didn't stop it because stopping it would have meant—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Would have meant looking at your father differently than you wanted to look at him," Mia said. Sandra looked at her. "Yes," she said simply. "I understand that," Mia said. "Do you?" Sandra asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Mia thought about her own father, about the letter in the lockbox, about the 30 years of small kindnesses she hadn't known about, hadn't been watching for, had absorbed without understanding, about how different it would have been to discover that her father had done harm instead of good. All that accumulated history suddenly inverting, becoming something that pressed down instead of held up. "Not from your exact angle," Mia said, "but I understand not being ready to see something, even when you already know it's there." Sandra drank her coffee. Jack turned a page in his book, which was the closest he was going to come to indicating that this conversation was happening at a safe distance from anything that required his intervention. "Is there anything I can do?" Sandra asked. "I mean that honestly. Not as restitution. Not legally. I know there's a case, and I know my involvement in that is whatever it needs to be, and I'm not going to avoid it. I mean personally, is there anything for the shop for what he tried to do?" "Keep coming back with your car," Mia said. Sandra looked at her. "That's all." "That's everything," Mia said. "People keeping their cars here is how this shop survived. It's how my father ran it for 30 years. It's not a complicated model." She paused. "What kind of car do you drive?" "A 2021 BMW 5 Series, Sandra said. "Leave it with me Thursday," Mia said. "I'll do a full inspection. Tell you honestly what it needs and what it doesn't." Sandra Voss looked at her for a moment, and something moved across her face that was complicated and honest and not entirely comfortable, the expression of someone in the middle of a moral reckoning that had a long way still to go. "All right," she said, "Thursday." After Sandra left, the shop was quiet for a moment. Then Jack said, without looking up from his book, "Your father would have done exactly the same thing." "I know," Mia said. She went back to work. The Camry's idle problem turned out to be a vacuum leak in a location that was deeply inconvenient to access, which was the kind of problem that required patience and methodical process, and a willingness to take apart things you'd rather leave assembled. She worked at it steadily through the middle of the day, and sometime around 1 in the afternoon, she found a cracked hose behind a bracket that would have been easy to miss, and that explained everything once you saw it. She fixed it. She put everything back together in the correct order. She started the engine and listened to it idle perfectly. The clean and even rhythm of a system returned to the state it was supposed to be in. There was a particular satisfaction to that sound that never got old, no matter how many times she heard it, the specific satisfaction of having understood a problem and solved it with your hands and your knowledge, and your patience of having taken something broken and made it whole. Her father had heard that sound thousands of times in this garage on this concrete floor surrounded by these tools. She was hearing it now in the same space, in the continuity of that, not the sentimental surface of it, but the actual lived substance of it. The fact that she was here doing this work in this building that still stood because it had turned out to be not just a building felt more significant than anything she could have articulated without it sounding smaller than it was. The formal legal proceedings against Richard Voss played out over the following months in the way such proceedings do unevenly, with advances and delays and motions and countermotions, and days where it seemed to stall, and days where it moved faster than expected. Cannon was excellent. He was as good as Walt had said he was, and there were moments when his skill in the courtroom was genuinely difficult to watch. When the architecture of what Voss had done was presented in angles that almost made it look like something else. But the signed directive held. The thing about evidence is that it exists outside of interpretation. You can argue around it, you can contextualize it, you can present it in the most favorable light available to you. But the document itself doesn't move. It says what it says. It was signed when it was signed. It named who it named. Voss was convicted on 5 of 7 counts. Walt called with the verdict on a Wednesday afternoon. Mia was in the garage. Jack was in the waiting room. She told Jack when she hung up, and he nodded and went back to his book. And that was approximately the right response, because the verdict was not the end of anything. Not really. It was the formal confirmation of something that had already been decided on a night in the parking lot when the motorcycles arrived, and Travis Holt looked around and did his recalculation. Frank Dempsey called that evening. He didn't say much. He said, "It's done." She said, "It's done." They were both quiet for a moment, and then Frank said goodnight, and that was enough. Della Monroe texted 2 words, "Thank you." Mia sat with that for a while because she wasn't sure she'd done something that warranted thanks in the specific way Della meant it. And then she thought about what Della had said at the diner in Livingston. You were the one who didn't sell. And she understood that the thanks wasn't for anything she'd done specifically, but for the fact of having held her ground, which had given everyone else the place to stand. You could not be a wall alone, but someone had to be the first brick. Her father had spent 30 years being first bricks in other people's walls without knowing it, without intending it, just by being who he was in the moments that presented themselves to him. That was the inheritance. That was what she carried. On the first Wednesday after the verdict, Jack came in at his usual time, the usual motorcycle, the usual paperback, the usual exact change for the oil. Change she'd have ready for him by 11. He sat in his chair. She poured his coffee. The morning settled into its rhythm, the shop warm and busy with the sound of work. Around 10 there was a lull. Mia came through from the garage and leaned against the counter and looked at Jack. "I have a question," she said. Jack looked up. "All right. When you were sitting in that waiting room the night they first came, before I even knew you were there, when they were breaking the machines and scattering my father's tools, what were you thinking?" Jack was quiet for a moment, not gathering his answer, just being honest about whether to give it. "I was thinking about a night about 25 years ago when I was sitting on the side of a highway with a blown gasket and no money, and a decision to make about what I was going to do next," he said. "And a man drove up in a truck and got out and didn't ask me anything except what was wrong with the bike, and fixed it, and wouldn't take payment, and said," he paused. "What?" Mia asked quietly. "He said a person should fix what is broken when they have the ability to do so." Jack looked at her steadily. "I thought about that, and then I thought about whether I had the ability." He picked up his coffee cup, and I decided I did. Mia stood at the counter and felt something move through her that had no name she could reach, but that was real and present and connected to something much larger than herself. The invisible thread that ran from her father's hands to a highway 25 years ago, to a waiting room on a rainy evening, to a parking lot full of motorcycles, to 4 people in a diner in Livingston, to a document with a signature at the bottom, to a verdict delivered on a Wednesday afternoon. All of it connected. All of it building towards something her father had never planned, never intended, never known he was doing. She looked around the shop. The Ranger from Derek's fleet in Bay 1. The Camry she'd fixed yesterday, idle perfect now, waiting for its owner. The pegboard with her father's wrenches. The toolbox with his initials scratched shallow and uneven into the top. The coffee maker in the waiting room that had never once held a current magazine on the rack beside it. "Thank you, Jack," she said. Jack set down his coffee cup. Your father did the work, he said. I just paid the debt. No, Mia said. He didn't do it to create a debt. He never kept score. He just, yes, helped, Jack said. Just helped, she said. Jack nodded. He picked up his paperback. The shop went on around them, warm and busy and present, the sound of engines and work and ordinary human activity, the sound that Carter's classic auto repair had been making for 30 years and was going to keep making. Because some things, when they are built from the right materials, do not come down when someone tries to take them apart. Some things are built so deep into the people around them that destroying the structure would require destroying the people, and people who carry something that good inside them are not so easily destroyed. Richard Voss had built his power from acquisition, from the relentless identification and taking of what other people had made. He had been very successful at it for a very long time because he had correctly identified that most people, when isolated and pressured and exhausted, would eventually break. What he had never understood, what his entire model depended on never being true, was that some people are not alone even when they look like they are. Some people carry with them invisibly the loyalty of everyone they have ever treated with genuine decency. And that loyalty, when it is called upon, does not show up as a legal argument or a financial resource or a formal alliance. It shows up as motorcycles on a dark highway arriving one by one until there are too many to count. It shows up as a man sitting quietly in a waiting room watching, deciding, choosing to stay. It shows up as a daughter who opens the doors at 7 in the morning because her father taught her that the work is the answer, and the answer is to keep going, and keeping going is an act of faith in everything that made you. Carter's classic auto repair stood. It stood because of what Daniel Carter had put into the world piece by piece, day by day, without accounting for it, without knowing it was building toward anything, without asking for anything in return. And it would keep standing. Not because a court said so, not because the numbers said so, not because any external authority had declared it safe, but because the thing it was built from was not concrete or steel or money or legal protection. It was built from the kind of human decency that outlasts everything that is thrown against it. And that is something no one, no matter how much they have, or how long they have had it, or how ruthlessly they are willing to use it, can ever take away.